This is it, the ultimate dimension for rest and stories, and it's called Sleepy Myths.
It started on a night that didn't feel entirely like a night. The air outside was still, as if the wind had forgotten its lines. Somewhere far off, the hum of the universe seemed to drift closer, brushing against the windows of the Smith house like a quiet visitor. The stars above didn't twinkle. They pulsed gently, breathing in and out, as if the sky itself was alive and listening. Morty lay awake in the half-light of his room, eyes tracing constellations he didn't remember learning. His sheets were cool, tangled around his legs like soft vines, the kind that grow only in dreams. He blinked once, twice, and then he heard it, a sound so faint it might have been imagined, a low, rhythmic hum. It wasn't coming from the house. It wasn't coming from Rick's lab either. It came from everywhere and nowhere all at once, and then softly he realized the hum carried a pattern, a pulse, a name. His name, Morty. It wasn't a voice exactly, more like a vibration. The syllables floated through the air and dissolved into warmth. He sat up slowly, not frightened, just curious. The clock on his nightstand read 2:17 a.m., but the digits flickered, confused. He wondered if time had gotten lost somewhere between its numbers. For a moment he thought about waking Rick, but the thought faded quickly. Rick had been sleeping in the garage again, surrounded by the glow of machines that never truly rested. Morty pictured him there, hunched in a chair, half a bottle beside him, lights blinking across his face like tiny mechanical stars. The old man never really slept. He drifted, like space debris between moments. The hum grew softer. The stars outside shimmered, pulling inward, as if the universe was folding itself into some small secret shape. Morty pressed his forehead to the window pane and whispered, "Why me?" But the stars didn't answer. They only kept breathing, patient and eternal. He thought maybe this was just one of Rick's experiments leaking through dimensions again. It wouldn't be the first time the cosmos had accidentally whispered someone's name. But something about this felt different, too gentle, too knowing. Before we go further, Morty thought suddenly, where are you? Whoever was listening, whoever might hear this story later, he wondered what time it was there. Was it night too? Were the stars breathing in your sky as well? He smiled faintly at the idea that someone, somewhere, might be lying awake under the same soft hum. Outside, the moon lowered itself behind the trees, and the night deepened into velvet silence. Morty leaned back, resting his head against the wall. The glow from his bedside lamp flickered and dimmed, leaving only the faint silver light from the window. It felt like being inside a held breath. He tried to remember what Rick had said once about the stars, something about them being ancient nuclear engines that don't give a damn about your teenage angst. But that didn't feel right anymore. Tonight, the stars felt tender. They weren't far away. They were with him. Morty closed his eyes. Behind his eyelids, the light still moved, swirling, gentle, infinite. Each point of light seemed to contain a tiny version of himself, smiling, running, sleeping, dreaming. The hum deepened until it became a single steady note, like a lullaby held on the edge of silence. He imagined walking through space barefoot, each star soft beneath his feet, each step echoing like the start of a new thought. In that moment, he felt both incredibly small and impossibly large, like his body was just one note in the song of everything. From the garage below, a faint mechanical click broke the stillness. Then the low buzz of one of Rick's inventions winding down. Even the machines seemed tired tonight. Morty stood and wandered quietly down the hallway, careful not to wake anyone. The floorboards creaked in rhythm with his heartbeat. He paused at the door to the garage and looked through the small window. Rick was there, slumped in his chair, mouth open slightly, one hand still holding a small screwdriver. Around him the lab glowed in soft blues and purples. The lights didn't flash sharply tonight. They shimmered slowly, pulsing in time with the same rhythm that had called Morty's name. Morty watched him for a while. Rick looked peaceful. The lines on his face seemed gentler, as though the years had decided to rest too. Morty wondered if deep down Rick could hear the stars whispering as well, if he recognized the song. He turned back toward the stairway and climbed quietly up to his room. Outside, the world was completely still now. Even the hum had faded into memory. Morty lay back down, pulling the blanket to his chin. He stared at the ceiling and tried to match his breathing to the rhythm he had heard before. Thin out, slow, steady, like the stars. He began to think about how strange it was to feel seen by something so vast. How the stars didn't judge, didn't demand, didn't explain. They simply existed, radiant and silent. Maybe that was the secret, he thought. Maybe everything was supposed to hum quietly and just be. He let that idea settle in the space between his thoughts, soft as dust. Somewhere deep in the walls, the old house sighed, as if agreeing with him. A nightbird called once and then fell quiet again. Morty turned on his side, eyes half closed, still tracing faint patterns of light on the ceiling. He whispered to the dark, "If you're out there, thanks for saying my name." No one answered, but somehow that silence felt kind. The stars outside had finished folding inward. Now they seemed to rest, content. The world exhaled. Morty's body grew heavy, his thoughts like small boats drifting towards sleep. He could almost hear the hum again, softer now, as if it lived inside him. It wasn't calling him anymore. It was keeping him company. As his breathing slowed, a warm stillness filled the room. The glow of distant galaxies flickered gently across his face. And before his mind slipped fully into dreams, Morty thought, maybe this is what it feels like when the universe remembers you. The night answered with silence, a silence shaped like love. Morning arrived slowly, as if it too had trouble waking. Light pooled through the blinds in soft ribbons, moving across the floor with quiet patience. Dust drifted in the air, swirling lazily, every speck a tiny world floating between seconds. Morty sat on the edge of his bed, hair tousled, mind still halfway inside the strange calm of the night before. The hum of the stars lingered in his memory, not as a sound now, but as a feeling that pulsed faintly under his skin. He tried to hum it back to recall its rhythm, but the melody had no edges. It dissolved into morning. Somewhere below, the house stirred. Coffee gurgled in the pot. A floorboard creaked in the hall. The normal world was returning step by step. Morty pulled on his hoodie and padded barefoot toward the garage, toward the place where things didn't always have to make sense. The air in Rick's lab smelled faintly of ozone and burnt circuits, a scent that had somehow become comforting. The space was cluttered with the ordinary evidence of impossible things, half-finished experiments, glass tubes humming with soft light, a slice of toast that hadn't aged in 4 years because of a time-freeze accident no one talked about anymore. Rick was nowhere to be seen, though a half-drunk mug of coffee rested dangerously close to a bubbling beaker. Morty set it aside and noticed something gleaming beneath a pile of papers, a small round clock. Its surface was scratched, the metal dulled with years of touch. He picked it up carefully, expecting to see the usual slow rotation of hands, but there were none. Only a blank face, smooth and luminous, ticking softly. He tilted it in his palm. Tick, tick, tick. The sound was steady, comforting, alive. Yet without hands there was no telling what time it believed in. He brought it closer to his ear. The rhythm felt familiar, almost like breathing, in, out, as though the clock itself was dreaming. Behind him, a groggy voice muttered, "If it's ticking, don't fix it." Morty turned. Rick stood in the doorway, hair wild, lab coat unbuttoned, eyes squinting at the light. He rubbed his face and reached for the coffee without looking. Morty held up the clock. "What is this thing?" Rick waved a hand vaguely. "Old project. Didn't work? Or maybe it did. I don't remember." He sipped and grimaced. "You'd be amazed how many things work better when you stop trying to make them perfect." Morty turned the clock over in his hands. "It doesn't have hands, though," Rick shrugged. "Yeah, neither do half the universes we've been to. Still keeps moving." He shuffled toward his workbench and began rearranging tools that didn't need rearranging. Morty watched him for a moment, waiting for an explanation that never came. Finally, he nodded slowly and slipped the clock into his hoodie pocket. "Don't lose it," Rick mumbled, "or do. It's not like it cares where it is." Morty left him there among the quiet machines and stepped back into the warmth of the day. The air outside was bright, the kind that hums softly in your chest when you breathe it in. He walked down the street towards school, fingers brushing the round shape in his pocket. Each tick felt like a heartbeat that wasn't his, keeping time for something else entirely. At the crosswalk, he paused and took it out again. Sunlight rolled across its surface, but still no hands appeared. For a moment, he wondered if maybe the clock wasn't broken at all. Maybe it was just telling a kind of time that couldn't be seen. The time of moments between thoughts. The time of growing up quietly when no one notices. He smiled a little. That sounded like the kind of riddle Rick would pretend wasn't profound. At school, the day passed in slow ripples. Teachers spoke in low tones that blurred together like wind through curtains. Morty doodled spirals on his notebook, loops within loops, patterns that never really ended. Every so often he touched the clock again, feeling its steady pulse. It comforted him in ways he couldn't explain, like it was proof that even without direction, movement was possible. At lunch, he sat under the tree by the fence. The light through the leaves made shifting mosaics on his shoes. He wondered if anyone else could hear their own time moving, if maybe everyone carried a silent clock inside them, unseen, unwound, always ticking toward something. He thought of the stars whispering his name. Maybe they'd given him this, he thought, a reminder that he didn't need to know when or how. Just to keep going. After the final bell, he wandered home slowly. The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the pavement. They moved like soft rivers flowing ahead of him. When he reached the porch, he stopped to listen. Not for the hum this time, but for the steady rhythm in his pocket. Rick was on the couch, asleep again, television murmuring softly in the background. Morty sat beside him without speaking. He placed the clock on the table between them. Its ticking seemed to blend with the sound of Rick's breathing. Two rhythms, perfectly mismatched but somehow harmonious. Morty leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. The ticking reminded him of the stars, how they'd folded inward the night before, as if collapsing gently into some deeper truth. Maybe this was part of that same mystery. A clock that kept time without hands, a universe that spoke without words, a boy who listened without knowing why. He thought about what Rick had said, "Don't fix what already works." The phrase lingered like a small glowing truth. Maybe not everything broken needed repair. Maybe some things were just meant to be felt. Evening crept in quietly. Shadows melted into the corners of the room. The TV light flickered blue across Rick's face. Morty picked up the clock once more, holding it against his chest. The ticking synced with his heartbeat until the two became one sound, he whispered softly. As if telling the stars a secret, "I'll keep it safe." The clock didn't answer, but the warmth beneath his hand grew stronger, a slow pulse, gentle and patient, like the rhythm of the world itself. Outside, the first few stars began to appear again, one by one. They didn't twinkle. They breathed, and somewhere far beyond what eyes could see, the universe ticked quietly along, not with seconds, but with moments of understanding. Morty fell asleep on the couch beside Rick, the clock still pressed against his chest. Its steady rhythm carried him into dreams of quiet light and endless sky. It was the kind of morning that felt like it had been waiting for something to happen, though no one could say what. The air outside was washed in pale gold, and the clouds looked like they were thinking about raining, but never decided to. Morty walked through the school gates with the same small weight in his pocket, the clock with no hands, still ticking its invisible time. Every few steps he touched it just to feel the rhythm. It steadied him, like a soft heartbeat that wasn't his, but kept him grounded anyway. The world moved quietly. Conversations blended into murmurs. Lockers opened and shut like mechanical sighs. Morty drifted through it all with a calm he couldn't explain. The stars hadn't whispered again since that night, but sometimes when he blinked, he thought he could see them behind his eyelids, a faint memory of light breathing slow. In science class, the teacher's voice rolled gently over the room, soft as static. Morty stared at the sunlight sliding down the wall. That's when he noticed her. She sat 2 rows ahead near the window. Hair dark, short, and a little messy, like she'd just come in from a windy place. She wasn't looking at the board. She was holding something small and silver, a recorder, the old-fashioned kind with a red blinking light. Every few seconds she pressed a button, waited, then pressed it again. Morty couldn't hear what she was recording. There wasn't anything to record. The room was still, but she kept doing it, with a patient focus that made it feel important. At lunch, he found her sitting alone under the same tree he'd sat by the day before. The recorder was beside her tray. She looked up as he approached but didn't seem surprised, as if she'd been expecting someone. "Hey," Morty said quietly, unsure what to do with his hands. She nodded once. "Hi." He gestured toward the recorder. "You recording the wind or something?" She smiled faintly. "Sort of." I'm collecting echoes, Morty blinked. Echoes? Yeah. She picked up the recorder, pressed play. For a moment there was nothing, just the faint crackle of empty air. Then came something soft, almost impossible to hear, a sound like a sigh caught halfway through a dream. This one, she said, was from the hallway this morning. Nobody was there, but something was. I think spaces remember what happens inside them. I just try to listen. Morty sat down beside her. You think the air keeps memories? She tilted her head. So doesn't yours? The question hung between them, shimmering quietly. I'm June, she added after a pause. Morty. She smiled again. I know. They didn't talk much after that. Just sat there, sharing the kind of silence that feels like it has its own pulse. June would lift the recorder now and then, capturing small nothings, the rustle of leaves, the low hum of fluorescent lights, the sound of the world breathing in. By the end of the day, Morty found himself walking home slower than usual. The memory of her voice lingered like music, collecting echoes. It sounded strange, but it also made sense in a way he couldn't explain. He thought of his clock ticking softly in his pocket. Maybe it was an echo too, not of sound but of time. That evening when he stepped into the garage, Rick was working again, sparks rising from some impossible contraption. Hey, Rick? Morty began. Do you think? Sound can stick to places. Rick snorted. Everything sticks to places. That's what places are for. No, I mean like memories of things people said. Rick didn't look up. Sure, if you've got the right kind of ears. Morty nodded slowly. He wasn't sure if Rick meant it seriously, but maybe that didn't matter. Later, in his room, Morty lay on his bed and held the clock above him. The steady tick seemed louder tonight. He wondered if June would ever try to record it, if she could catch that rhythm, that sound of time moving without proof. He thought of her sitting under the tree, eyes half closed, listening to invisible things. She hadn't seemed lonely exactly, just tuned differently, like she existed in a slightly slower version of the same world. Morty reached for his notebook and wrote a single line. The girl who listens to silence hears everything. He set the notebook aside and turned off the light. The room settled into darkness. For a long time he just listened, to the creaks, the ticking, the distant hum of the house breathing. Every sound felt alive, as if the walls themselves were waiting for someone to remember them. Half asleep, Morty thought he heard a faint click outside his window, a sound like June's recorder starting again. He smiled, not knowing if it was real or dream. Maybe she was recording the night, collecting the echo of stars falling inward. The next day they met again beneath the same tree. June handed him one of her earbuds. Listen, she said. He did. The sound that filled his ear was soft but rich. Layers of quiet stacked on top of each other. A hallway, the soft thud of footsteps, the flicker of lights turning on. A chair scraping gently against the floor. And underneath it all, something that sounded like a heartbeat. I didn't put that there, she whispered. It just showed up. Morty's hand instinctively moved to his pocket where the clock rested. He felt its ticking through the fabric, matching the rhythm of the heartbeat in her recording. Maybe it's time, he said softly. Like actual time. June looked at him, eyes glimmering like they held tiny stars. Maybe it's listening to us too. They sat together as the afternoon light shifted into gold. The wind carried their breath away in small invisible threads. Morty felt something inside him loosen, a quiet joy, a sense that he didn't have to understand everything to feel connected to it. When the final bell rang and students poured out, June pressed the recorder into his hand. Keep it for a while, she said. See what it finds when you're not looking. Morty nodded, speechless. That night, back in his room, he placed the recorder beside the clock on his nightstand. The two sat side by side, one measuring invisible seconds, the other collecting invisible sounds. He turned off the light and listened. At first, there was only silence. Then, after a while, a single faint sound, like the whisper of his own breath being played back to him. It was an echo, he realized. His own. The sound of being alive. He smiled softly in the dark, and sleep came like a tide, slow, sure, full of light. The nights grew softer after June came into Morty's world. Her recorder sat quietly on his desk beside the clock with no hands, both ticking in their own secret ways. The room felt alive, not loud but full, as if the air itself remembered things. Outside, the sky pulsed with the faint rhythm of hidden stars. The kind of stars that didn't twinkle anymore, just breathed. Morty watched them through his window, eyes heavy but awake. He didn't know what he was waiting for, only that something was about to begin. That was when he first heard it, a low hum beneath his bed, like the sound of electricity pretending to sleep. At first he thought it was just the clock acting up again, but when he leaned over the edge and peered into the darkness, he saw a faint light, blue and soft, like moonlight trapped in a bottle. He hesitated, then knelt down. His breath fogged slightly, though the air wasn't cold. The light flickered once, then steadied, forming the outline of something impossible. A small, rectangular door, no larger than a notebook. Glowing quietly against the floorboards, it shouldn't have been there. He knew his room by heart. Every scratch on the wall, every loose board underfoot. But tonight something new had grown between them, a door between days. He reached out and touched it. It felt real, at warm, pulsing faintly beneath his fingertips. Then it opened. Inside was not darkness, but reflection, a mirror that didn't show him now but other hymns. Countless versions scattered like stars, some younger, some older, some unfamiliar. One stood in a white suit covered in paint, holding a brush dripping gold. Another sat in a small spacecraft, staring through glass at a red horizon. One was just a child, sitting in a field of glowing grass, laughing at something unseen. Each one looked back at him, and though none of them spoke, their silence felt like music, an unspoken greeting across dimensions. Morty felt no fear, only a strange calm. These weren't strangers. They were all him, every possibility that time had once whispered into the folds of his soul. For a long while he just watched. Then slowly, every version of him lifted a hand in the same motion, a quiet wave. Morty smiled. "Hey," he whispered, unsure if the sound could travel across whatever this was. The others didn't answer. They just kept waving, in a soft, patient kind. When he blinked, the door closed. The glow faded. His room returned to ordinary dimness. Only the echo of warmth remained against his hand. He sat back on his bed, heartbeat steady but changed. He didn't dream that night, or maybe he did, and the dream had already happened while he was awake. The next day, the world felt slightly tilted, as if time had leaned a little closer to him. The sky seemed deeper. His reflection in the bathroom mirror blinked a fraction slower than he did. When he got to school, June noticed. "You look like you've been somewhere," she said quietly. "Yeah," Morty answered. "Maybe I have." They sat under their tree again, sharing the recorder between them. June pressed record and tilted her head. "Tell me what you heard," she said. Morty thought for a long moment. "Not sound," he said finally. "Just versions of me. Like dreams, like choices." He paused. They were all waving. June smiled in that slow, knowing way she had. "Maybe they're waiting for you to listen." The words lingered in his mind long after school ended. That night when he came home, Rick was in the garage again, tangled in a mess of wires and glowing glass. Morty hovered near the doorway. "Hey, Rick." Rick didn't look up. "Do you ever think we've got versions of ourselves watching us? Like somewhere else?" Rick grunted. "Morty, I've met like 62 versions of myself. Most of them are jerks." "Why?" Morty shrugged. "Just wondering if they're happy." That made Rick pause. He turned slightly, one eyebrow raised, as if the question had touched a nerve. "Happiness is just chemicals, kid. Different universes, same brain soup." Morty nodded but didn't believe him. When Rick turned back to his work, Morty slipped away quietly, carrying the thought like a secret candle. That night the door was there again. He didn't touch it right away. He just sat on the floor and looked at it, the way it shimmered softly, waiting without demand. He wondered what would happen if he stepped through. Would he become one of the others? Would they trade places? Or maybe there was no difference anymore. Maybe they were all parts of the same reflection, scattered through time like echoes through space. He pressed his ear against the glowing frame. A faint hum filled him, the sound of countless lives breathing at once. It wasn't language, but he understood it. It said, "You are not lost. You are just unfolding." He smiled softly and let the sound settle into his chest. When he closed the door, it left behind a faint shimmer on the floorboards, like dust made of starlight. He sat there a while longer. the ticking of the clock mingling with the hush of the room. The recorder's red light blinked quietly on his desk, capturing everything, the air, the stillness, the feeling of the moment before tomorrow. The next morning, Morty brought the recorder to school and handed it back to June. "Here," he said. "I think it recorded something." She pressed play. For a few seconds there was nothing. Then came a faint hum, low, layered, infinite. It wasn't the sound of a room or a voice. It was something larger. June's eyes widened. "What is that?" Morty smiled faintly. "I think it's me, or all of me." She listened a little longer, her expression softening into wonder. "It sounds like time breathing." "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think it is." They sat in silence for a while, letting the sound fill the air between them. The hum felt warm, like sunlight spilling across a field. When the final bell rang, Morty looked at her and said, "If there was a door that showed you every version of yourself, would you open it?" June thought carefully. Only if it opened both ways. Morty didn't ask what she meant. He just nodded. Somehow he already understood. That night when he returned home, the door didn't glow right away, but he could still feel it there, waiting. Like an idea that didn't need proof to be real. Before he went to sleep, he whispered softly into the dark, the same way he had spoken to the reflections the night before. "Good night," he said. Somewhere, in 1,000 quiet universes, 1,000 versions of him whispered it back, and when he finally closed his eyes, the stars behind his eyelids felt closer than ever, not watching, not judging, just listening. Morty woke to the feeling of weightless quiet. The air didn't move, yet it seemed to watch him. The light that usually crept through his curtains was softer now, almost unsure of itself, as if dawn had forgotten what it meant to rise. He sat up slowly and rubbed his eyes. His room looked the same, but the silence had changed its shape. It wasn't empty anymore. It was listening. The clock with no hands ticked patiently beside his bed, still marking moments that didn't exist. Beside it lay the recorder, June's recorder, blinking faintly with leftover memory. Morty pressed the button and the hum played again, but deeper this time, layered with something new, a whisper that sounded like him. He couldn't catch the words. They slipped away before forming, but the tone felt familiar, like a thought he'd had too many times to remember when it started. He set the recorder down and looked toward the floor. The little glowing door under his bed was gone now. In its place was only shadow. But when he moved, the shadow didn't follow. It stayed still and aware, like it had been waiting for him to notice. Morty blinked. Hi?" The shadow tilted its head. It didn't look wrong. It just didn't look obedient anymore. It was his outline, yes, but alive in some quiet way, shimmering faintly at the edges, like it remembered light differently than the rest of the room. "I'm dreaming," Morty said to himself. "Maybe," the shadow whispered. The voice wasn't from the airs, it came from within, from the exact space where his doubts usually lived. It wasn't loud or scary. It sounded like him when he was honest. Morty sat back on his bed, heart steady but wide awake. "So you can talk?" "Not talk, just return what you don't say out loud." He looked at it for a long moment. The words didn't echo. They landed softly, as if the air had been waiting for them too. "What do you mean?" The shadow shifted slightly, like a quiet ripple in light. "You hide things in me, Morty, worries, regrets, small truths. I'm where you put the feelings you don't want to see." Morty frowned. "That sounds depressing." "No," it said gently. "That's how light stays bright." He didn't know how to answer. The stillness around him deepened. He noticed the hum of the clock had matched the rhythm of his heartbeat. Outside, birds began to sing faintly, as if the world was listening in on his conversation. Morty leaned forward. "So, what do you want?" The shadow hesitated, then whispered, "To be seen." For a long while he didn't move. He remembered moments when he'd been angry at Rick and said nothing, when he'd been scared and pretended to be fine, when he'd wanted to tell June that he liked the way she listened, really listened, but the words never came. Maybe all those unsaid things had been collecting here, in the darkness shaped like him. He swallowed hard. "Okay," he said quietly. "I see you." The room seemed to exhale. The shadow grew softer at the edges, less sharp, less separate. "That's all I needed." Morty smiled faintly, though he didn't understand it all yet. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you ever wish you were light instead?" The shadow paused. Then in a voice that felt almost like laughter, "Do you ever wish you were me?" Morty blinked. "Maybe sometimes, then we already understand each other." The whisper faded. The shadow returned to its ordinary place, matching his movements again as if nothing had changed. But something had quietly, deeply. He could feel it humming beneath his skin, a strange peace that wasn't happy or sad, just true. Later that day, Rick noticed him staring at his reflection in the chrome surface of a disassembled portal gun. "Morty, you're not about to have some kind of existential puberty thing, are you?" Rick muttered, squinting through his goggles. Morty shook his head. "Just thinking." "Yeah, that's what I'm afraid of," Rick said, then went back to tinkering. But Rick watched him secretly. The kid's movements were slower now, calmer, less twitchy. Like something inside him had settled. Rick didn't ask, but in the back of his mind he knew the look. He'd seen it in mirrors on the nights he couldn't sleep. The look of someone learning to live with themselves. That evening Morty met June by the bleachers. She sat cross-legged, writing in a small blue notebook. "Hey," she said, not looking up. "You look different." "Do I?" "Yeah, lighter," she smiled. "Which is funny, 'cause your eyes look darker." Morty chuckled softly. "Maybe I'm both." June closed her notebook and looked at him for a long, thoughtful moment. Maybe that's what growing up is. Learning to hold both without breaking. They didn't say much after that. They just sat together as the sky deepened, the first stars blinking awake above them. Morty found himself tracing the outline of his own shadow against the bleachers, watching how it stretched and shifted beside June's. Her shadow leaned closer to his. For a moment they merged. He felt a strange comfort in that, like even his darker parts were allowed to rest near someone else's light. When he got home, Rick was asleep on the couch, one hand still holding a bottle of something that smelled like battery acid. Morty pulled a blanket over him and stood there for a moment, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest. The scientist who could build worlds but couldn't sleep through the night. Morty whispered to the still room, "It's okay, Rick. You don't have to fix everything." From the corner of his eye, he saw his shadow nod. Before bed, he looked once more at the floor where the little glowing door used to be. Nothing shimmered there now, but he didn't need it to. The real doorway was inside him, the quiet space between what he said and what he meant. As he drifted into sleep, he felt a weight lift from somewhere behind his ribs. The air hummed, almost like approval, and when dreams finally came, they were soft, unhurried things, filled with laughter that didn't need faces and light that didn't need a source. In one of them, he heard a whisper. Not warning, not fear, just recognition. You are not your light or your dark. You are the space between them. He smiled in his sleep. The stars outside flickered faintly in rhythm with his breathing, and in the quiet of his room, his shadow breathed with him. It began one quiet morning, the kind that didn't know if it wanted to be light or shadow. The sun drifted lazily behind thin clouds, spilling a pale warmth through the garage window, where Rick sat hunched over a pile of blueprints and coffee rings. Morty lingered by the door, unsure if his presence was wanted or just tolerated. With Rick, it was always both. On the workbench, amid scattered tools and glowing fragments of half-built inventions, lay a single folded piece of paper. Its edges were browned, torn at the corners, but it pulsed faintly with a soft electric blue, like it still remembered being alive. Rick didn't look up. "If you're gonna stare, Morty, at least make it useful." "Hand me that thing." Morty picked up the paper carefully. "This?" "Yeah, that." Rick sighed, rubbing his eyes. "That's not trash. That's something I drew a long time ago." Morty unfolded it slowly. It was a map, but not like any he'd seen before. The lines were not straight, but curved and looping like the veins of a leaf. Towns had names that felt half-dreamed. Whisper Vale, the place where rain forgets, Blue Memory Road. Some areas weren't even labeled, just spirals of ink fading into nothing. "What is this?" Morty asked softly. Rick took a long sip from his mug, then said, "It's a map of places that don't exist. Or maybe they do, just not in any one reality. I made it when I thought I could catalogue everywhere I'd ever been, even the ones that only existed in my head." Morty traced one of the faded lines with his finger. "Did you ever go there?" Rick's mouth twitched in a half-smile. "Kid, you can't get lost if you're not trying to arrive." The words hung in the air, strange and comforting at the same time. Rick shrugged. "You can keep it if you want. I've already been lost enough for both of us. Morty folded the map carefully and slipped it into his pocket. Thanks, Rick. Rick waved a hand without looking up. Just don't expect it to make sense. Nothing worth finding ever does. That night, Morty spread the map across his desk. The lamp's glow touched its faded ink, and the lines shimmered faintly, as if responding to the rhythm of his breath. The map didn't feel old anymore. It felt alive. He ran his finger over a blank patch where no roads were drawn, and for a moment he thought he saw movement, like dust swirling in a forgotten room. He didn't understand it, but he didn't need to. He closed his eyes and thought of June. The next morning he showed her the map under the same tree where they always sat. The air smelled faintly of rain and something older, like the earth itself had been listening. June leaned in, eyes wide. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It looks like it's breathing." Morty nodded. Rick said they're places that don't exist. Maybe they're places that just haven't been remembered yet. She took out her recorder and pressed play. The soft hum filled the air, blending with the rustle of leaves. "Let's pick one," she said. Morty pointed to a small circle near the edge of the map. "Here, Whisper Vale." "Sounds peaceful," she said. "What do you think is there?" He smiled faintly. "Maybe nothing." Maybe that's the point. That night, Morty dreamed of walking through a valley bathed in blue light. The ground shimmered softly like it was made of memory. June walked beside him, her recorder glowing faintly in her hand. The air wasn't silent. It was full of gentle whispers, not words, but feelings, like wind remembering what it once loved. They passed through arches of silver stone, and each one whispered a different sound. Laughter, ocean, heartbeat, sigh. Morty touched one and felt warmth, not from heat but from recognition. "What are they saying?" he asked. June listened for a moment. "They're not talking," she said. "They're remembering." He looked around. "Of who?" She smiled softly. "Of you." He woke before dawn, the dream fading like mist. But when he looked at the map, Whisper Vale glowed faintly, as if the ink itself had learned to dream too. In the days that followed, Morty and June began visiting the map together, not in person but in shared imagination. Every place they pointed to became a dream that night. Sometimes it was a vast field where clocks grew on trees and chimed in the wind. Other nights, a city made of glass bridges that sang when you walked on them. Once they drifted through a town where every house had a window facing the stars, and no one ever closed the curtains. Each dream felt more real than the waking world. Yet none were frightening or wild. They were gentle, like memories that didn't mind being borrowed. June started calling them the between places. Morty asked her what that meant. "They're the places between what we remember and what we forget," she said. "Maybe they only exist when someone cares enough to imagine them." He thought about that for a long time. So, what happens when no one imagines them anymore? June looked down at the map. Then they fade, like anything unloved. One evening, Morty brought the map back to Rick. "Do you think it's possible," he asked her, "that these places are real, just not in the way we think?" Rick didn't answer right away. He just stared at the glowing lines for a long while. "Kid," he said finally, "reality's just the universe agreeing to your version of the story. If the story's good enough, who's gonna argue?" Morty smiled. "So that's a yes?" Rick snorted. "That's a maybe. The kind that keeps people like me awake at night." He folded the map again and handed it back. "Keep going, Morty, just remember, maps are for wandering, not arriving." That night, Morty and June met again in the Valley of Dreams. They sat beneath trees that hummed softly with memories. June looked at him and said, "If every place on this map is a forgotten thought, then maybe we're the ones remembering the universe back into itself." Morty laughed softly. "That sounds like something Rick would say." She shook her head. "No, he'd say it's impossible. You'd say it's beautiful." He looked around and at the glowing leaves, at the silver rivers flowing backward into the horizon, and thought maybe both were true. When he awoke, the map on his desk shimmered once more, before fading into ordinary ink. But even as daylight poured across it, Morty could still feel the hum beneath the paper, the pulse of the places he'd found and those still waiting to be remembered. He whispered to it, "Just once before leaving for school, I'll come back," and somewhere, across the folds of time and dream, the map whispered back, almost too softly to hear, We know. Morning came like it didn't want to. The light was hesitant, sliding softly through the blinds in thin silver ribbons that caught the dust and made it shimmer. Morty woke to the faint hum of his desk lamp still on, the map still spread open where he'd left it. Its ink had dulled again, quiet and ordinary, but the silence felt different now, heavier, almost watchful. He rubbed his eyes and glanced at his hands. For a second, he thought the veins beneath his skin glowed faintly blue. He blinked hard and the light was gone, leaving only a soft ache under his fingertips, like the echo of a heartbeat that wasn't quite his own. He didn't tell Rick that morning. He just ate cereal in silence, while Rick worked on a plasma condenser, muttering equations under his breath and spilling coffee on the blueprints. The air smelled of ozone and burnt sugar. Morty kept flexing his fingers beneath the table, watching the faint shimmer that pulsed beneath the skin every few seconds. It wasn't constant. It came in waves like breath. Finally, Rick noticed. "You're twitching like a broken portal gun. What's up with you?" Morty hesitated. "It's nothing, just tired." Rick gave him a long look, one of those sideways glances that saw more than Morty ever wanted him to. But he didn't press. Instead, he said quietly, "Sometimes nothing is how weirdness says hello. At school, the world felt too bright. The hallways hummed with chatter and footsteps, but everything seemed muffled, distant, like he was hearing it underwater." June noticed right away. "You okay?" she asked as they walked out toward the field. He nodded. "Just didn't sleep." She tilted her head. "You're glowing," Morty froze. "What?" She smiled faintly, brushing a finger against his wrist. "Right there. Under the skin. Like starlight." He pulled his hand back instinctively, heart racing. It's probably just the light or something." But June just looked at him quietly, and he knew she saw it too. She took out her recorder, clicked it on and said softly into the microphone, "Day 27. The boy carries the map now. And it seems the map has begun to carry him." "June, don't relax," she said, her smile soft. "I'm not recording you. I'm recording the moment." They sat under their tree. The wind was light and smelled faintly of rain again. The grass around them shimmered faintly in the sun, like it wanted to join the conversation. "Rick says maps are for wandering, not arriving," Morty said quietly. "And what do you say?" He looked down at his glowing veins. "I think maybe. Sometimes the map finds you first." June's eyes softened. "Maybe it does." That night Morty lay awake staring at his ceiling. The glow was stronger now, faint threads of light moving slowly beneath his skin, like rivers tracing the shape of constellations. When he held his breath, they pulsed brighter. He sat up, turned off the light, and in the dark the glow looked almost beautiful, delicate, not frightening. It wasn't pain. It was something else, something alive. He touched his chest, and for a moment he thought he heard a whisper, not from outside, but inside. It wasn't words, just a feeling. Warmth, curiosity, memory. Then, like a ripple, a flash of light spread from his palm up his arm, fading as quickly as it came. Morty exhaled shakily. The next day, he went to Rick. "Something's happening to me," Morty said, voice unsteady. Rick didn't look up from his workbench. "Congratulations." "It's called puberty. Rick, I'm serious." Morty's voice cracked, the words trembling between panic and wonder. "There's light under my skin. It's moving." Now Rick looked up. His face shifted from sarcasm to stillness. "Show me." Morty lifted his hand. The light responded immediately, threads of faint blue rising beneath his skin like phosphorescent roots. Rick's eyes narrowed. "That's not biological. That's metaphysical." "Meta what?" "Means you've crossed a line you weren't supposed to." He leaned closer. "What have you been messing with?" "The map?" Morty nodded. Rick rubbed his forehead. "Christ, Morty, you let the damn thing in." "In?" Rick sighed. "That map isn't paper. It's a frequency. A dimensional pattern that links forgotten coordinates across space-time. When you look at it long enough, it starts syncing with your neural biofield." Morty blinked. "You mean it's alive?" Rick shrugged. "Alive, where's potato?" Morty swallowed hard. "Is it dangerous?" Rick didn't answer right away. "Only if you stop listening." That night Rick ran tests, scanners, quantum readouts, light field analysis. The readings didn't make sense. Morty's energy signature had doubled in strength, but showed zero cellular decay. His blood glowed faintly under UV light. Rick watched the monitor and muttered, "You're resonating with the map's memory layer. It's rewriting part of your biofield." Morty frowned. "In English?" Rick glanced at him. "You're becoming part of the story it's telling." Morty's mouth went dry. "Can you stop it?" Rick hesitated. "Don't think I should." "Why not?" "Because it's not killing you," Rick said quietly. "It's changing you. That's rarer." The next afternoon, June found him by the riverbank behind the school, sleeves rolled up, staring at his reflection. The water shimmered faintly blue where it touched his skin. "Does it hurt?" she asked. "No, it's just strange. Like there's light trapped inside me that wants out." June knelt beside him. "Maybe it's not trapped. Maybe it's learning your shape." He looked at her, and for a second everything around them seemed to slow. The wind, the ripples, even time itself. She reached out, fingers brushing his hand. For the briefest moment, the light passed from him to her, a faint pulse that made her gasp softly. "It's warm," she whispered. Morty stared. "You felt that?" She nodded. "It's like remembering a dream you didn't know you had." They sat there in silence, watching their reflections shimmer together. Later that evening, Rick watched Morty sleep through the lab monitor. The light beneath the boy's skin pulsed gently, like a heartbeat sinking to something vast and distant. Rick lit a cigarette, the smoke curling through the faint hum of the machines. He muttered to himself, "Every time the universe tries to teach me something, it uses you. Morty." He looked toward the old folded map on the table. It glowed faintly, like it was breathing. "Let's see where this goes," Rick whispered. When Morty woke the next morning, the glow no longer frightened him. It felt natural now, part of his pulse, part of his breath. He held out his hand and whispered softly, "Where are you taking me?" The veins of light flared once, then faded into stillness. For the first time, he didn't feel lost. He felt chosen, and somewhere beyond sleep and silence the map stirred, whispering of the next place waiting to be found. The rain began before dawn, a soft, steady whisper across the roof of the garage. It wasn't storm rain, it was remembering rain, the kind that sounds like something thinking out loud. Rick had been awake all night. Blueprints were spread across his workbench, smudged and old. Circuits glowed weakly beneath cups of cold coffee. Between them lay the map, or what was left of it, faint blue ink barely holding itself together. He kept staring at it, lips pressed thin as though trying to find a question small enough to ask. June sat quietly on the stool beside him, her recorder balanced in her lap. She hadn't spoken in a while. The silence between them felt fragile, like a dream you didn't want to wake from. Finally, Rick sighed. "Do you ever build something you thought would save someone, and it ends up changing the wrong person instead?" June looked up. "You mean Morty?" Rick didn't answer right away. He lit another cigarette, the flame trembling in his hand. "A long time ago, before all the portals and universes and family drama, I tried to build a machine that could stabilize emotion." June tilted her head. "You wanted to fix feelings?" Rick gave a bitter chuckle. "Wanted to make them measurable. Thought if I could quantify pain, I could delete it. Thought maybe I could make people happy without them having to earn it." He exhaled slowly. The smoke drifted up, mixing with the humming light of the lab. But emotions don't like being caged. The prototype, it didn't delete pain. It condensed it, turned it into energy. He gestured toward the map. "That's what this is, the residual pattern. Every coordinate on it is a place that once carried someone's emotional residue. Joy, grief, longing, all fossilized in space-time." June's eyes softened. "And Morty?" Rick rubbed his eyes, the lines on his face deepening. "He's resonating with it. The kid's always been open, too open. The map sees that, and it's rewriting him." June's fingers tightened around the recorder. "So you sound afraid." Rick's laugh was small, tired. "Fear's just love with a calculator." He looked down at his hands, calloused, scarred, shaking slightly. "He's becoming what I could never finish. The version of humanity I couldn't trust myself to believe in." Meanwhile, Morty stood outside in the rain, barefoot on the wet grass. The glow beneath his skin pulsed faintly, syncing with the rhythm of the falling drops. Each touch of rain left a trail of silver across his arms, fading into soft luminescence. He could feel it now. The connection, the hum. It wasn't just inside him anymore. The whole world seemed to be breathing with him, every raindrop whispering in time. He closed his eyes and let it happen, and in that stillness, he heard something new, Rick's voice, faint and distant, echoing through memory. "You weren't supposed to see this part yet." Morty opened his eyes. The world shimmered faintly blue, the trees bending like they were listening. For a heartbeat, he could see threads of light stretching from himself to everything around him. Every leaf, every puddle, every faint sound of thunder. It was all connected. It always had been. He didn't feel afraid. He felt infinite. When he walked back into the garage, Rick was sitting alone, staring at the ceiling. June had gone. The air smelled of solder and rain. Morty stood in the doorway, dripping water, hair clinging to his forehead. "You knew," Rick didn't turn. "Knew what?" "That this would happen to me." Rick's voice was quieter now, without its usual armor. "Yeah, I knew." Morty stepped closer. "Why didn't you stop it?" Rick finally looked at him. His eyes were red, not from alcohol this time, but from not blinking enough. "Because maybe it's what you were meant to be." Morty frowned. "I'm not meant to be anything. I just Rick smiled faintly. "That's the part I never figured out." He reached for the map, unrolled it slowly. The ink pulsed weakly like a dying heartbeat. "This thing, it's not paper, Morty. It's a projection of my own failed equations. I used emotional resonance as a stabilizing constant. I thought if I could fix one person's pain, I could fix the universe. I tested it once." "On who?" Rick's jaw tightened. "On myself." Morty blinked. "It didn't work?" Rick laughed, a small cracked sound. "Oh, it worked. Just not the way I expected. It took my guilt, my regret, my love, and scattered it across every timeline. That's what the map is. A graveyard of my own feelings." Morty stared at him, silent. Rick looked back down at the map. "When you touched it, it didn't consume you. It resonated. You harmonized with it. You're carrying all the things I tried to bury." Morty took a slow breath. "So, I'm becoming your mistake?" Rick shook his head. "No, kid. You're becoming the answer to it." Hours passed like minutes. The rain stopped. The lab lights flickered softer now, casting pale halos on the walls. Morty sat cross-legged on the floor, tracing faint constellations in the map's ink with his fingertip. "You said it's made from your emotions," he murmured. "What happens if I keep changing?" Rick leaned against the wall, voice low. "Then maybe you'll find something worth believing in that I never could." Morty didn't respond. His skin glowed faintly again, brighter this time, like the light had grown confident in him. Rick watched, expression unreadable. "Oh, you're not scared?" Morty looked up. "I used to be, but it feels like everything's trying to teach me something. The stars, the map, even you." Rick gave a dry laugh. "If I ever start teaching you, run." Morty smiled, a small warm one that made Rick look away too fast. Later that night, Rick sat alone after Morty went to bed. The rain had stopped completely, leaving only the soft ticking of cooling metal. He stared at the empty spot where the map had been. Morty had taken it upstairs. He poured himself a drink but didn't touch it. The glass caught the dim light, and for a second, he thought he saw his reflection flicker, not the old, tired man, but the version of himself from long ago, before all the losses. He whispered to the empty room, "You were supposed to save me, kid, not the other way around." The sound of the rain returned, faint but steady, or maybe it never stopped, just changed into something gentler. Morty couldn't sleep. He sat by his window, the map spread on his lap, its edges softly glowing. He thought about Rick's words, about guilt turned into coordinates, about emotion crystallized into light. He pressed his glowing hand against the map. This time the paper didn't resist. Inside it breathed. A faint pattern shimmered across it. A new point of light blooming near the edge, pulsing like a heartbeat. Morty smiled. "Guess I'm part of it now." He leaned back, eyes half closed, listening to the quiet hum filling the house. Somewhere in another room, Rick was still awake, and though they didn't speak, something invisible connected them, like an unbroken thread humming softly through the dark. The light beneath Morty's skin flickered once more, then settled into calm. Outside, the rain began again, washing the night clean. Morty dreamed of walking through a place that remembered him before he arrived. The ground shimmered like glass, faintly blue and silver, And trees grew there, tall, silent things with bark that gleamed as though it had learned how to hold light. Their branches didn't sway in wind. They breathed in rhythm with the stars. At first, Morty thought it was another of Rick's inventions, a simulation, a hidden experiment tucked behind the folds of sleep. But then he saw the way each tree pulsed softly, like a living heartbeat. He reached out, and when his fingers brushed the nearest trunk, a sound filled the air. It was laughter, his own laughter. The kind that once came easily, back when summers still smelled like grass and cereal, before portals and paradoxes. It echoed gently, circling him, then drifted upward until it dissolved into the pale starlight. Morty stepped back, breath slow, eyes wide. Every tree hummed with a different tone, a melody woven from memory. Some sounded like rain against windows, others like his mother humming in another room. One whispered Rick's name in a way that didn't hurt. He wandered deeper. The orchard stretched endlessly, the trees glowing in soft gradients, gold for joy, violet for loss, blue for questions that had never been answered. And as he walked, he realized something strange. Each light pulsed in time with his heartbeat, as though they had always belonged to him. He reached another tree, smaller, crooked, but bright. Its leaves shimmered silver. He touched its trunk, and a soft image unfolded in the air. June sitting beside him at the school steps, recording the silence between raindrops. Her eyes calm, her voice saying, "Maybe everything wants to be heard." The image faded. The tree stilled. Morty smiled faintly, whispering, "Yeah, maybe." He continued walking, following a faint trail of light that wound through the orchard like a river. The trees grew denser now, their glow dimming to twilight hues. These weren't joyful trees. They were quieter, older, the kind that carried heavier things. Morty's chest tightened as he stepped between them. When he brushed one trunk, the air filled with Rick's voice, younger, lighter, full of hope. "We'll fix everything, kid. You'll see." Then another, deeper voice, and the Rick he knew now answered, almost whispering, "We never fix anything, do we?" The echoes overlapped, rippling through the orchard like wind through leaves. Morty pressed a hand over his heart. It wasn't sorrow he felt. It was recognition. These memories weren't meant to trap him. They were asking to be seen, to be held without resistance. He sat down beneath one of the trees. Its roots glowed faintly beneath the soil, like veins of light. Around him the orchard breathed. The stars above shifted slower, as if time itself had grown tired. Morty closed his eyes. He listened. There were memories he'd forgotten on purpose, moments too small or too painful to keep. Yet here they were, blooming again in gentle shapes. The time he got lost in a grocery store, and Rick pretended not to panic. The way Summer had once shared her blanket on a cold night without saying anything. The day he found an empty soda can still warm from someone's hand, and felt for no reason at all, like the universe had sighed. Each memory shimmered around him like falling petals. They didn't demand attention. They drifted patient, waiting for him to forgive himself for not remembering sooner. Morty whispered into the stillness, "You're all me, aren't you?" The orchard answered with the soft sound of rustling leaves. He opened his eyes. Before him, a single tree stood apart from the rest, dark, unlit, quiet. Its bark looked like shadow solidified. Something about it pulled at him, gentle but insistent. He walked closer. As his fingers neared the trunk, he hesitated. He could feel the memory inside, heavy, dormant. The air around it was colder, slower, but there was no fear. Just wait. He touched it instantly. The orchard dimmed. The stars above went still. And in the silence he saw himself, younger, standing beside Rick during one of their earliest adventures. He remembered that day now, the chaos, the mistake, the look on Rick's face when Morty almost didn't make it back. The scene replayed, quiet and slowed. Rick's trembling hands, the muttered curse, the silence afterward. Morty whispered, "You blamed yourself, didn't you?" The vision didn't speak, but something deep within him shifted, a knot loosening. A sigh escaping from the center of his chest. He stepped back, and light began to bloom from the dark tree. Faint at first, then golden, warm, alive. The branches trembled softly, releasing glowing petals that floated upward like tiny lanterns. One petal landed in his palm. It pulsed gently as though breathing. He held it close. "It's okay now," he said softly. "We made it. The orchard brightened. Every tree seemed to shimmer in response, their lights syncing to a shared rhythm. The air filled with soft sound, laughter, whispers, rain, all blending into one endless hum. Morty looked around. The world was luminous but calm. There was no border between light and shadow anymore. Everything just was. He understood then that the orchard wasn't a place outside of him. It was his mind learning to listen. Each tree was a moment he'd once tried to forget, still growing patiently in silence. Memory wasn't something that trapped him. It was what kept him whole. He sat there for a long time, hands open, letting the petals fall. Some carried joy, some carried sorrow. None asked to be anything else. When he finally woke, morning light filtered through his window. The rain had stopped, replaced by quiet sunlight spilling across the floor. Rick's map still lay folded on his desk, faintly glowing where his fingers had pressed it. Morty smiled, eyes still heavy with sleep. He felt softer inside, like something had rearranged itself without needing to be fixed. He whispered to the empty room, "Everything grows different when you stop looking away." Outside, a breeze passed through the yard, stirring the leaves of a small tree that had sprouted near the fence. Its branches caught the light in the same way the dream trees had, quiet, steady, forgiving. Morty didn't notice, but maybe he didn't need to. The orchard wasn't somewhere he had to visit again. It was already part of him now, breathing with every thought, glowing quietly beneath the surface. He lay back down, eyes half closed, feeling the hum of the world around him. The line between dream and waking thinned. Somewhere far above, the stars seemed to lean closer, listening, and before sleep took him again, he thought he heard them whisper. Not his name this time, but a single word. Stay. There was a sound that morning, a low hum beneath the clouds, like the world had forgotten which direction to turn. Morty woke to it, soft and distant, echoing through the corners of his room. The map on his desk trembled faintly, its blue ink rippling like water touched by wind. He sat up, heart calm but alert, and whispered, "I hear you." The light coming through the curtains looked strange, like it was flowing the wrong way, bending inward instead of outward. He followed it through the house, down the stairs, through the garage where Rick slept in his chair, empty bottle balanced loosely in his hand. Morty stepped carefully past him and opened the back door. Outside, the yard wasn't a yard anymore. It was water, endless, slow-moving, shining like liquid glass. The fence posts and trees floated like half-remembered thoughts, and somewhere in the distance, the hum grew into the murmur of a river. June stood on the edge of it, her shoes barely touching the surface. She turned as if she'd been waiting all along. "You heard it too," Morty nodded. "It called me." June smiled faintly. "Then we should listen." They stepped forward and the river accepted them. No splash, no ripple, only the gentle pull of current beneath their feet. The water moved backward upstream toward something unseen. Above them, clouds drifted in reverse, unforming themselves into blank white memory. Morty felt the current's cool pressure against his ankles, a sensation that wasn't quite physical. Each step drew them deeper into stillness. The air shimmered like it was holding its breath. June raised her recorder. "This place doesn't make sounds," she murmured. "It remembers them." Morty looked down. Beneath the surface, faint images floated, moments flickering like film frames. Him and Rick arguing in the garage, Summer laughing with friends, his mother staring out a window. They moved against the current, drifting past him backward in time. "What are they?" he asked softly. "Unchosen paths," June said. "Lives that almost happened. Every time you made a decision, something else kept going without you." Morty knelt, peering closer. He saw another version of himself, taller, hair messy, standing in a small bookstore surrounded by plants. Another older, sitting quietly beside a campfire under alien stars. Another who never met Rick at all, smiling vaguely, living an ordinary, quiet life. The sight didn't ache. It didn't sting. "It just was. They look happy," Morty whispered. June watched them pass. "Maybe they all are in their own way. You can't measure happiness in endings." He smiled faintly. "Rick would argue with that." June laughed quietly, a sound like glass touching water. "Rick argues with gravity. Doesn't mean he's wrong." The current thickened. The farther they walked, the clearer the visions became, whole worlds folding backward. Morty saw universes collapsing into themselves, stars retreating into infancy. Time here wasn't cruel or chaotic. It was gentle, reversing itself with care, returning everything to its source. Morty's reflection moved differently from him now. When he lifted his hand, it waved before he did. When he blinked, it smiled back a second too soon. He spoke softly, not to June, not to the river, but to that other him. "Do you remember me?" The reflection nodded. Morty felt a warmth spread through his chest, recognition without words. The reflection reached out, touching the surface. Morty did the same, and for a heartbeat, his fingers met themselves. The touch sent ripples across the current, and light flowed upward like breath. He saw flashes then, the orchard, the stars, the door beneath his bed, all woven into one long thread. Everything that had ever happened to him, and everything that hadn't, folding together in quiet symmetry. When the light dimmed again, June was watching him. "You saw it, didn't you?" "Yeah," he said. "Everything I was, and everything I wasn't," June nodded. "That's what the river shows. It doesn't rewrite, it reminds." They continued walking. The current began to rise, curling around their knees, carrying with it faint echoes, voices layered over one another, speaking in languages Morty didn't know but somehow understood. Each whisper was soft, like a wish never said aloud. "If only I had stayed. If only I had gone. If only I had loved sooner." The river didn't judge them. It carried them with the same tenderness it carried light. June turned the recorder toward the water. "You can't capture it," Morty said. "I know," she replied, "but maybe I can learn how to listen better." Eventually the current slowed. The river widened into a still pool that mirrored the sky perfectly, so perfectly that it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. June stopped at the edge, eyes reflecting the color of distant stars. "This is the heart of it," she said softly, "where everything goes to rest before becoming something new." Morty stared into the pool. Beneath the reflection of stars he saw a faint shadow, his own, rippling faintly. "What happens if I step in?" June hesitated. "You'll forget something. But you'll understand why you had to." Morty took a slow breath. "Maybe that's okay." He stepped forward. The surface accepted him like sleep. The water climbed around him, soft and warm, and for a moment the world went completely silent. In that silence, he heard something he hadn't heard in years. Rick's laughter, unguarded and real from some long-forgotten day. He felt Summer's arm looped through his mother's hand smoothing his hair, June's calm voice saying, "You're doing fine." The sound faded, leaving behind only peace. When he opened his eyes, he was standing on dry ground again. The river behind him glowed faintly, still flowing backward. June stood beside him, recorder in hand, tears catching the light. "You okay?" she asked. He nodded. "I think I left something behind. What was it?" He smiled gently. "The need to know everything." June looked at him for a long time, then pressed play on the recorder. Static filled the air, soft, rhythmic, almost musical. Beneath it faintly was the hum of the river. Morty listened, eyes half closed. "Sounds like the world breathing," she nodded. Maybe it finally learned how. By the time they returned to the shore, the house stood waiting, unchanged. Rick was still asleep in the chair, head tilted back, muttering faintly in his dreams. The map lay folded on the table, pulsing once, twice, then settling. Morty and June stood in the doorway. The air smelled of rain and ozone. She looked at him, voice soft. "Will you remember this?" "Maybe," he said. "But even if I don't, it'll remember me." June smiled faintly, and for a heartbeat Morty thought she was glowing too, just a little. They didn't say goodbye. They didn't need to. The river behind them flowed on, backward and endless, carrying away every unanswered question until only stillness remained. The air that evening was made of slow gold, that soft, syrupy hour when the sun hesitates before leaving. Morty and June walked in silence, following the faint echo of ticking that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere. The river's hum faded behind them, replaced by the rhythm of countless clocks whispering through the mist. Each step they took, the ticking grew clearer, like a heart remembering its pulse. They crested a small hill, and there it was, a house that didn't seem to belong to the world around it. Its walls shimmered slightly, as though built from folded time rather than wood or stone. The windows glowed with pale amber light, the kind that made you think of warmth you hadn't felt since childhood. June tilted her head, listening. "Do you hear it?" Morty nodded. "Every clock in the universe, maybe." They stepped closer. The front gate was open, swinging gently on hinges that creaked in the rhythm of breath. On the door, instead of numbers, someone had carved words. "All things that wait eventually become." Morty ran his fingers over the letters. "Do you think it's safe?" June smiled faintly. Nothing this patient could ever be dangerous. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cedar and dust, like an attic full of memories. Dozens of clocks lined the walls, tall ones, tiny ones, clocks shaped like eyes or stars. None of them agreed on the hour. Some ran backward, some skipped beats, a few ticked so slowly that Morty could barely see the hands move at all. June's gaze wandered. "They're all telling different times. Maybe they're all right," Morty said softly. She looked at him, and something about that answer seemed to settle deep in her. In the center of the room stood a large pendulum, its surface made of mirrored glass. It swung lazily, though no mechanism seemed to drive it. Each time it passed, Morty's reflection looked a little older, a little calmer, as though the mirror knew where he was going before he did. He touched it once. The air rippled outward, and the ticking paused for a heartbeat. Then a voice, quiet, patient, drifted from somewhere upstairs. "I thought you'd come back sooner." June looked up, eyes wide. "Who said that?" Before Morty could answer, the house exhaled. The stairs creaked softly and light pooled at their feet. At the top stood an old man, or perhaps not old at all, but worn in that timeless way trees and oceans are. His eyes were clear and kind. "You've both been walking for a long time," the man said. "Come in, time's been keeping your place." Morty hesitated. "Do we know you?" The man smiled. "You will once you've forgotten enough." June stepped forward first. "What is this place?" He gestured around. "It's where lost hours wait to be remembered. Every clock here holds a moment someone left behind, a minute they didn't finish living, a sigh they never released." He walked to a small, dusty shelf and lifted a pocket watch. Inside, Morty could see a tiny scene replaying, himself as a boy standing on the roof with Rick counting stars. "That night," Morty whispered. "When he told me stars aren't promises, they're possibilities." The man nodded. "You never finished listening to what he meant. You left the roof before he was done." June tilted her head. "So time keeps the rest?" The man smiled. "Time keeps everything. It's people who forget." Morty felt something shift quietly inside him. Not sorrow, not nostalgia, just understanding. The man turned to June, holding out a different clock, smaller, silver, shaped like a teardrop. "And you," he said gently. "Oh, you've been recording what you should have been remembering." June's hands trembled as she took it. Inside the glass, she saw herself as a little girl, sitting alone by a window, humming softly to the rain. "I thought that moment was gone." "Nothing is gone," the man said. "It only rests until someone cares enough to visit." They stood there for a long time, surrounded by soft ticking and memory. The sound wasn't sharp anymore. It was gentle, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. Morty looked around. "Can I take one of them?" The man chuckled quietly. "They're not things to take, boy. They're things to carry differently." He walked over to the pendulum and tapped it lightly. The reflection shifted. For a breath, Morty saw not himself but Rick, older, thinner, standing in the same spot, staring back. Their eyes met through time. Rick's reflection smiled faintly, not the usual crooked grin, but something tired and true. Then he was gone. Morty stood frozen, throat tight. "Was that real?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he said softly, "Every love, every pain, every lesson leaves an echo. Some are strong enough to find their way back." June placed a hand on Morty's shoulder. "Maybe that was him saying he's proud of you." Morty swallowed. "He'd never say that out loud," she smiled. "That's why he said it like that." The man began to fade, his form blending with the slow pulse of the clocks. "Don't try to understand this place," he murmured. "Just rest here for a while. Time will keep itself tonight." They sat together on the old couch near the window, surrounded by quiet ticking. June leaned her head on Morty's shoulder. The light from the pendulum cast slow-moving patterns on the walls, like waves remembering the sea. "Do you ever think," she whispered, "that maybe time isn't something we lose, but something we learn how to hold?" Morty nodded. "Like sand in your hand. The tighter you grip it, the less you have." Her voice softened. "So what do you do?" "You open your hand," he said, "and let the wind remember it for you." They didn't talk after that. They just listened to the clocks, the sighs between seconds, the slow breathing of the world. And somewhere deep within the house, a new clock began to tick, faint, steady, perfectly in rhythm with their hearts. Outside, night arrived with kindness. The sky folded itself around the house like a blanket, and the last rays of sun lingered on the windows as if reluctant to leave. When Morty finally closed his eyes, he could still hear the pendulum swinging, soft, patient, endless, and he thought, maybe for the first time, that he didn't need to rush anywhere anymore. He was exactly where time wanted him to be. The morning arrived without sound. Not silence, and that would have been too clean. This was something softer, deeper, like the world was holding its breath just beyond the window. Morty woke to find the light strange, stretched thin across the ceiling, as though it were remembering how to be morning. The faint hum of the clocks from the night before had vanished. The air itself seemed to have forgotten rhythm. He turned toward the chair near the window where June always left her backpack, half unzipped, with the recorder resting on top. But it was gone. The backpack, the sound of her soft, deliberate breathing, her presence, which had always filled the room like a calm tide. Gone. He sat up slowly. "June!" His voice sounded too loud, too awake, no answer. Only the quiet rustle of curtains brushing against glass, like they were trying to say her name for him. He searched the small house, though he already knew. The hallway felt longer, emptier. The air carried no scent of her, the faint trace of lavender and static that had always followed her around, like the memory of a storm. On the kitchen table lay her recorder, the one she'd used to collect the sound of silence. Its little red light still blinked. He pressed play. Nothing came out at first. Then, beneath the static, he heard something that wasn't quite a sound, more like the shape of breathing deep and far away. He turned up the volume. It wasn't hers. It was the world itself, asleep, dreaming through her absence. Morty closed his eyes. The ache that filled his chest didn't feel sharp. It wasn't heartbreak or panic. It was more like stillness, a kind of space that love leaves behind when it changes shape. He remembered what June had once said. Absence isn't empty. It's just love with its voice turned down. He sat for a long while, listening. Outside, the day moved slowly, as if mourning too. The sky was pale blue, washed thin by time. The wind had forgotten how to sing through the branches. Morty stepped outside, holding the recorder like a compass. He didn't know what he was looking for, only that standing still felt wrong. He followed the sound of silence across the fields behind the house. Grass brushed against his legs like whispers. In the distance, the horizon shimmered faintly, not from heat but from memory. He walked until the world began to fade into dream logic again, where edges softened and distances hummed. It was that familiar space between waking and not, where time folded politely around thoughts, and there, just past the tree line, he saw it, a shimmer, like the glow beneath his bed door from years ago. The one that had shown him other versions of himself. But this glow was dimmer, softer, like a candle flickering at the edge of sleep. He stepped closer, the recorder still in hand. The light pulsed gently, and he thought, for a moment, he could hear a laugh. June's laugh. "Quiet like water over smooth stones, June," he whispered. The light wavered. Then the wind changed and it was gone. He stood there until dusk folded the world into blue. The ache in him didn't swell or break. It simply existed, a companion, a mirror. When he finally turned back toward the house, the stars were already rising, those same stars that had once whispered his name. Tonight they said nothing, but their silence felt kind. Rick was in the garage when Morty returned. The old man didn't look up right away. He was tinkering with something that hummed faintly, a device that looked half alive. Without turning, Rick said, "You look like you've been walking through a poem." Morty gave a tired smile. "She's gone." Rick tightened a screw, squinting. "People always are eventually." She didn't say goodbye. Rick sighed, still not looking at him. "Nobody ever does the way you want them to." Morty leaned against the doorframe. "Do you think she'll come back?" Rick hesitated just long enough for the silence to answer. "Some people don't come back, Morty. They just leave pieces of themselves that keep you company when you think you're alone." Morty placed the recorder on the workbench beside him. "Then I guess this is my piece." Rick finally looked up. His eyes were tired but soft. "You could do worse," Morty nodded. "I think I'll listen for a while." That night he sat outside under the porch light with the recorder resting on his knee. The night air smelled of rain that hadn't yet arrived. He pressed play again, static. Then faintly the breathing, rhythmic, patient, endless. Morty closed his eyes. As he listened, he began to notice small sounds he hadn't before. The slow turning of the earth beneath his feet, the hush of distant trees, even the hum of the stars as they climbed across the sky. He realized then what June had been trying to teach him all along, that silence wasn't something to fear or fill. It was something to be heard. He let the silence wash through him. Every heartbeat sounded slower, like a drum keeping time for the universe itself. He whispered into the night, "If you can hear me, I'm listening." The wind stirred softly in reply, not words, but feeling. Hours passed without him noticing. When he finally rose, the world felt lighter, though nothing had changed. The recorder blinked faintly, still capturing everything. Every breath, every pause, every quiet miracle. Inside, the clocks had started again. They ticked gently, out of sync, like a lullaby with too many verses. The pendulum swung in the hall, Emma slow, patient. Morty lay down on the couch. He held the recorder close to his chest, as though it were alive, as though it might dream too. And in the soft dark, he began to hum. It wasn't a song, not really. Just the sound of someone remembering how to be whole. The stars outside blinked slower, calmer in rhythm with him. The house sighed once, content. And somewhere far away, or maybe not far at all, a girl smiled in her sleep, hearing it. The days that followed were slower than time itself. They passed like clouds drifting across a quiet sky, changing shape, but never hurrying. Morty moved through them gently, as if not to disturb something sleeping beneath the surface of everything. He had stopped asking where June had gone. The ache had softened into something quieter, not absence, but presence in another form. It lived in the corners of rooms, in the hum of the air, in the soft pulse of the clocks that surrounded him. Rick noticed. He didn't ask questions. He just left tools on the workbench, bits of wire, broken glass, fragments of old inventions that hummed faintly with the ghosts of ideas. One morning, Morty stood before them and felt a pull, quiet but certain, like the beginning of a memory. He didn't know what he was making, only that his hands moved, like they were remembering something his heart had already decided. It began with a shard of glass from one of Rick's abandoned experiments, a lens meant to hold starlight. Cracked but still glowing faintly when turned in the dark, Morty held it up, and the light trembled across his skin like something alive. He found an old copper frame beneath the bench, bent and twisted, and straightened it with care. A filament of silver wire, almost too thin to see, became the spine. He didn't rush. Every motion felt sacred, deliberate. Rick watched from across the garage, pretending to work on something else. He didn't interrupt. The boy's concentration reminded him of himself, back when invention had still felt like prayer instead of penance. Morty soldered the frame together, the light flickering in his eyes. For the first time in weeks he hummed, a tune with no melody, just a pattern of breath and memory. The same rhythm he'd once heard from June's recorder, the quiet breathing of the world asleep. By evening the frame was complete, fragile, beautiful, imperfect. He placed the glowing shard inside, wrapped it in a thin film of transparent metal, and sealed it gently with a sigh. When he stepped back, it wasn't just a lantern. It was something more. A vessel of quiet, a shape made of all the moments that couldn't be spoken aloud. The light inside didn't flicker like fire. It pulsed, slow and steady like a heartbeat remembering its rhythm. Rick finally broke the silence. "What's it do?" Morty thought for a long time before answering. "I think it listens," Rick frowned. "To what?" "To everything we forget to notice." That night Morty carried the lantern outside. The stars had gathered thickly overhead, hanging low like they wanted to see what he'd built. He placed it on the porch and sat beside it, knees drawn to his chest. The glow spread softly across the wood, painting the night in silver and gold. Even the insects seemed to quiet, respecting its calm. Rick came out after a while, flask in hand, eyes distant. He stood there watching the light breathe in the dark. "You know," he said, voice rough, "I used to think light was just energy. Photon's speed equations. Then one day I realized it's the only thing that doesn't really die. It just keeps going until someone's ready to see it. Morty looked up at him. Maybe that's what forgiveness is too. Rick blinked slowly. You've been reading my mind again, kid? Morty smiled faintly. Nah, just listening. Rick sat down beside him, knees creaking, flask untouched. For a long while they didn't speak. The lantern's glow reflected in Rick's tired eyes, softening the lines there. It made him look almost peaceful. After some time he muttered, "It's beautiful." "You made that out of my junk?" Morty nodded. "Out of your memories, maybe." Rick exhaled a laugh, quiet, unsure. "Guess that makes it radioactive." But the laugh faded quickly. He watched the light again and whispered, "She'd like this, wouldn't she?" "The girl," Morty nodded. "I think she already does." They sat there until the night grew heavy and blue. The light didn't fade. It seemed to grow gentler, softer, as if matching the slow rhythm of their breathing. At some point, Morty said, "When I look at it, it feels like time slows down. Not stops, just stretches like it's giving me room to breathe." Rick studied it quietly. Maybe that's all time ever wanted, for someone to stop running through it. The lantern pulsed again, faint and steady. Morty whispered, "Do you think things remember us, even after we're gone?" Rick didn't answer right away. He looked out at the stars. "If we remember them," he said finally, "it's only fair they return the favor." They both fell silent again, letting the thought drift away. Later, when Morty went back inside, he left the lantern on the porch. Through the window he watched it glow, steady as a heartbeat in the dark. He lay in bed, unable to sleep, and listened to its hum. It wasn't mechanical. It was something else, like the murmur of a distant ocean. He realized then that the light was carrying something, a weight he hadn't noticed lifting until now. Grief had changed shape. It was still there, but gentler, easier to hold. He whispered into the dark, "Thank you." The lantern glowed a little brighter, and for the first time since June had disappeared, Morty dreamed of her not as someone gone, but as part of the light. She stood in the glow, smiling, calm, proud, infinite. When morning came, Rick found the lantern still shining faintly against the pale dawn. He stood there for a while, one hand resting on the porch railing, staring at the glow. He didn't say anything, but his eyes softened, a quiet admission he'd never voice. Inside, Morty was still asleep, breathing evenly, peaceful. Rick muttered under his breath, "You're getting good at this, kid." Then he looked out at the horizon, where the first rays of sun met the faint glow of the lantern, and whispered, so softly even the universe had to lean in to hear it, "Maybe that's what love does. It builds things that keep shining after we stop." That night Morty lit the lantern again. He didn't ask it for answers. He didn't wait for visions or voices. He just sat beside it and listened, to the hum, the stillness, the life in every quiet thing. Time slowed. Breath softened. Light became thought, thought became memory. Memory became peace. And in that gentle stillness, Morty felt the world forgive itself, not because it had to, but because it finally could. The day began without warning, geese, as if someone, somewhere had quietly rewritten the laws of light. At first, Morty didn't notice. The morning felt normal, except softer somehow, like the world had been brushed clean. The light through his window didn't angle. It simply existed, even an absolute falling across his room without edges or boundaries. He blinked, sat up, and reached for his shoes. That's when he saw it. The floor beneath him glowed evenly, no darker shapes following his movements. No shadow from the chair, no silhouette from the lamp, nothing. "Rick?" he called, heart tightening a little. Rick was already in the garage, staring at the walls, his lab coat illuminated like a ghost. "Yeah," Rick muttered, without looking up. "You see it too?" Morty nodded slowly. "Where are the shadows?" Rick sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Nowhere. Everywhere. Depends how you want to define the absence of directional light. But yeah, this shouldn't be possible." He picked up a wrench, turned it in his hand, frowned. "Light's coming from every direction at once. No source, no reflection. It's like the universe decided to turn on ambient mode." Morty watched him, uneasy. "Is it dangerous?" Rick hesitated. "Everything's dangerous. But this..." He paused, looked up at the glowing air. "This feels more like an invitation." They stepped outside. The neighborhood looked the same, and yet completely alien. No shadows stretched beneath the trees. No contrast divided road from curb or sky from earth. Every object glowed softly from within, as if the world had become self-illuminated. The air shimmered faintly, not hot, just aware. Birds flew silently, their wings cutting no dark lines across the ground. For a moment Morty felt dizzy, like his mind couldn't process a world without depth. Everything was visible, yet nothing stood apart. "Rick," he whispered, "I can't tell what's real." Rick's voice was low, contemplative. Maybe that's the point. They walked to the edge of town. No sun in the sky, only a diffuse silver glow that seemed to come from the horizon itself. It was light without origin, pure and borderless. No shadows meant no direction. No direction meant no sense of time. Hours passed, or maybe seconds. It became impossible to tell. People gathered in the streets, confused but calm. No panic, just collective awe. Conversations drifted in quiet tones, as if everyone had agreed not to disturb whatever this was. A child held up her hand and giggled. "Look, Mom!" My fingers disappeared. Her mother smiled faintly, though her eyes glistened with something deeper. Wonder or fear, or maybe both. Rick and Morty stood near the fountain in the park. Its water moved silently, every droplet glowing from within like liquid glass. Rick crouched, scooping some into his palm. The liquid didn't refract. It held the same even tone as the air. He let it drip through his fingers, and it left no trace. "Light without direction," he murmured. "Means no shadows, no heat, no loss. No entropy." Morty tilted his head. "You mean—" Time stopped again. Rick's lips twitched into a half-smile. Not stopped. "Just stopped choosing sides." Morty frowned. "What does that mean?" Rick gestured at the world around them. "Look at it. Everything's visible at once. No front, no back, no before or after. Maybe the universe is showing us what existence looks like when it doesn't have to keep track of itself." Morty stood silent. The idea felt too big to hold, like trying to remember a dream while still inside it. By afternoon, though there was no real afternoon anymore, the quiet deepened. Even the wind seemed hesitant to move. Morty walked through the streets, lantern in hand. The glow within it pulsed softly, though now it was almost invisible against the equal brightness of the world. He looked into its heart and whispered, "Do you still work, even when everything shines?" The lantern responded with a faint tremor, not sound but feeling, as if saying, "I was never about light. I was about remembering where it came from." Rick watched him from a distance, arms crossed. "Are you talking to your nightlight again, kid?" Morty smiled faintly. "Maybe it's talking to me." Rick chuckled, shaking his head. "You're starting to sound like me, and that's terrifying." But his voice lacked mockery. There was something almost tender beneath it, the unspoken pride of a man who'd forgotten what wonder felt like until now. As the endless day stretched on, something subtle began to happen. Colors softened. Edges blurred. The air seemed to grow warmer, not from heat but from closeness. People began to move slower, speaking less, breathing in sync without meaning to. It felt as though the entire planet had taken one long, collective breath and decided to hold it. Morty felt it in his chest, a stillness that wasn't silence, but peace. Rick finally whispered, "You feel that?" Morty nodded. "It's like everything's listening." Rick's voice broke softly. "Yeah, maybe for the first time in forever." Then, as quietly as it began, the light started to fade. Not dim, but separate. Shadows slowly returned, creeping out from beneath objects like shy memories. The trees grew edges again. The fountain began to sparkle instead of glow, and on the horizon a single bright point appeared, the sun. Small, ordinary, familiar, people gasped. Some cried. Some laughed in relief. Others just stood still, unwilling to let go of whatever peace they'd touched. Morty watched his own shadow reappear on the ground, a dark outline, fragile but real. He crouched beside it, tracing its edge with a fingertip. "It feels heavier now," he said softly. Rick nodded, eyes distant. "That's because now you remember what it means to have one." Morty looked up. "You think it'll happen again?" Rick shrugged. "Maybe. But even if it doesn't, we'll remember it. That's how light survives." Night came gently, like a sigh. Morty set the lantern on his windowsill. Its glow was visible again, small but steady. He thought of the day when no one had cast a shadow. The calm, the stillness, the quiet equality of existence. He whispered. Maybe that's what time really wants, not to move, but to be seen. From the corner of the room, Rick spoke softly. And maybe what we want, he said, is to remember that being seen is enough. Morty turned, surprised Rick was still awake. The old man sat in his chair, eyes half closed, face lined with both fatigue and light. For once, neither of them said anything clever. They just sat there, two figures in the half-dark, sharing the silence between shadow and glow. And outside, the stars, bright, infinite, alive, began to return one by one, like slow forgiveness. Rick fell asleep without warning, his head slumped over a cluttered bench, the soft hum of machinery slowing into silence. A thin trail of smoke curled from a half-finished invention, spiraling upward before fading into the stillness of the garage. Morty found him like that, motionless but peaceful, the faint glow of the lantern casting patterns across his face. Something about the quiet pulled at Morty's chest, a strange gravity that whispered, "Go closer." He touched Rick's arm gently. The moment his fingers brushed the fabric of Rick's coat, the room shifted. The air bent. The smell of oil became the scent of rain. The lights dissolved into sky. Morty blinked, and suddenly he was standing inside Rick's dream. The first thing he noticed was the silence. Not the kind that felt empty, but the kind that held everything. The hum beneath sound, the breath before words. Around him stretched a vast plain of metallic earth, gleaming under a soft blue haze. Strange objects lay scattered like fossils, broken inventions, fragments of glass, coils of wire that pulsed faintly as if dreaming too. In the distance stood a tower built from discarded machines, each one ticking out of rhythm, each one remembering what it had once tried to be. And at the base of that tower, Rick, younger, cleaner, eyes sharp and alive, was talking to someone small. Morty stepped closer. The child was Rick too, a tiny version, no older than 10, hair sticking up like static, eyes full of impossible ideas. The younger Rick held a small orb that glowed softly in his hands. "If I can make the world better," he said, "maybe I'll finally stop feeling like it's broken." Older Rick crouched beside him, voice low. "It doesn't work like that, kid. Fixing things doesn't fix you," the boy frowned. "Then what's the point?" Rick didn't answer. His face softened, and for once he looked uncertain. Morty watched them, two versions of the same man, separated by time but united in ache. He felt like an intruder in someone else's memory, yet also like a witness to something sacred. The ground rippled beneath him. From the metallic soil grew shapes, not plants, but memories, inventions that had failed, machines that had exploded, devices meant to save lives that had only broken hearts. Each one shimmered faintly, whispering fragments of voices, echoes of the people Rick had loved, lost and tried to bring back. Morty walked among them slowly. He saw Beth's laughter trapped in a glass tube, tiny and infinite. He saw the faint outline of a portal gun that kept opening and closing, but never led anywhere. He saw a chair that glowed like a heartbeat. When he touched it, he heard Rick's voice, the version of him from years ago, soft and tired. Every invention is a confession, Morty, a way of saying, "I wish things could have been different." Morty's eyes stung. He turned back toward the two Ricks. The younger one was crying now, clutching the orb to his chest. "I just want to stop feeling alone," the boy said. Older Rick placed a trembling hand on his shoulder. "Then maybe stop trying to outsmart loneliness." The tower of machines began to tremble. The dream was changing. Morty felt the pull of something deeper, a door opening within the air itself. He followed it, stepping through walls of light that folded like paper. On the other side, he found a room that looked exactly like Rick's garage, but cleaner, untouched by time. A large clock hung on the wall, the same one Morty had found weeks ago, still ticking without hands. But now it glowed with a soft pulse, almost alive. Morty stepped closer. "Rick!" From behind him, Rick's voice, older again, the one Morty knew. "You shouldn't be here, kid." Morty turned. Rick stood at the doorway, face lit by the dim blue glow. "I didn't mean to," Morty said quietly. "I touched your arm and—" Yeah, dream physics, whatever." Rick sighed, rubbing his temples. "Figures you'd find the one place I actually keep private." Morty looked around. "Is this where you go when you sleep?" Rick hesitated. "Where I go when I stop pretending not to care." The clock began to hum louder. Morty stepped closer to it. "It's still ticking," he whispered. Even without hands, Rick walked up beside him, gaze distant. "Yeah, that thing's a mistake I made trying to freeze a moment in time. Thought I could hold on to something before it slipped away." "What moment?" Rick exhaled. "The one before everything went wrong." The ticking grew softer, slower, as if listening. Morty reached out, placing his glowing hand against the clock's face. The metal warmed beneath his touch. "Maybe it's not broken," he said. "Maybe it's waiting." "Waiting for what?" "For you to forgive it." Rick's jaw tightened. "It's a clock, Morty. It doesn't—" But before he could finish, the ticking stopped. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, thick, tender, like the pause between heartbeats. And in that silence, the clock spoke, not with words, but with light. Images flickered across its surface, moments from Rick's life, a child's laughter, a woman's silhouette, a portal swirling open, a family dinner that never happened. Rick stood frozen, eyes wide. "I didn't ask to see this," he muttered. Morty turned to him. "Maybe it's showing you what still matters." Rick swallowed hard. For once he had no clever retort, no shield of sarcasm. Just a quiet, fragile humanity that felt heavier than all his inventions combined. The dream began to fade, the room unraveling like smoke. Morty felt himself being pulled backward, the images dissolving into starlight. But before he slipped away, he reached out and touched Rick's shoulder gently. Rick turned toward him, eyes glassy but clear. "You already did," Morty whispered. Rick frowned. "Did what?" "Make the world better." For a moment, the dream held perfectly still. The machine stopped humming. The light stopped shifting. Time, thought, and memory seemed to exhale together. Rick blinked, and for the first time in years he smiled. Not a smirk, not a grimace, but something soft. "Something real, yeah," he murmured. "Maybe I did." Morty woke up in the garage, the hum of machines returning. Rick still slept beside him, head resting on folded arms, face peaceful. The clock on the wall ticked quietly, still without hands, still alive. Morty looked at it and smiled faintly. It didn't need to measure time anymore. It simply existed like them, imperfect, luminous, forgiven. He whispered, "Thanks for letting me see." And from somewhere inside the silence, a voice seemed to answer. Not Rick's, not the clock's, but the dream itself. "You can't fix the world by changing it. You fix it by remembering you belong to it." Morty closed his eyes, breathing in the stillness. Outside, the stars pulsed faintly in rhythm with the ticking, a slow, gentle reminder that some clocks don't count seconds, they count peace. That night began with silence, deeper than any before. It wasn't the silence of absence, it was the silence of completion. The moment a song finishes and lingers in the air, humming softly in the bones of whoever had listened. Morty sat awake in his room, the faint glow of the lantern he built, still flickering beside him. The clock with no hands, the one he'd kept close for so long, had finally stopped ticking. He hadn't noticed at first. The absence of sound felt so natural, like the world had simply exhaled and decided not to inhale again for a while. The air was heavy but kind, filled with the warmth of things that had ended gently. The walls seemed to breathe. The stars outside his window pulsed in slow rhythm, one by one, dimming, brightening, as if matching the pace of a sleeping heart. Rick was downstairs, maybe asleep, maybe not. Morty didn't need to check. He could feel Rick's presence like gravity, steady, worn and real. He ran a hand through his hair and looked around the quiet room. Every object held a kind of shimmer tonight. The half-open notebook, the lantern, the dust motes floating lazily in the air. Everything was awake but resting. He whispered almost to himself, "Is this what stillness feels like?" No answer came, and yet he felt one, like a soft nod in his chest. As the night deepened, time began to fold in strange, tender ways. The shadows in the corners of the room didn't move. They stayed perfectly still like photographs. The air didn't flow. It simply existed. Even Morty's breath seemed slower, quieter, each inhale blending seamlessly into the next. He stood and walked through the house. In the hallway, he saw echoes, not ghosts, not illusions, but moments, shimmering like reflections on glass. There was himself, years younger, chasing Rick through the same hall, laughing until he couldn't breathe. There was his mother, singing softly in another room, her voice calm, almost lullaby-like. Each echo smiled as he passed, fading gently into the stillness. When he reached the living room, he found the air full of tiny orbs of light, slow-moving, pulsing softly, hovering above furniture like memories that had chosen to stay. Each one made a faint sound when he touched it, not words but emotions. One hummed like nostalgia, another like forgiveness, another like laughter remembered but no longer sharp. He walked among them slowly, reverently, as if wandering through a cathedral built from everything he had ever felt. Outside, the world had stopped turning. He stepped out into the yard, bare feet sinking slightly into cool grass. The stars above were frozen mid-twinkle. The wind had ceased. Even the air seemed to glow faintly. The trees leaned toward him, unmoving yet alive. He looked up at the sky and realized the moon wasn't drifting anymore. It was simply there, suspended, flawless, whole. He could feel the transformation deep inside him now. Not a surge, not a change, but an unfolding. As though every version of himself, across every door he had once seen beneath his bed, had gathered here tonight, breathing as one. He whispered, "I can feel you." The stars didn't answer, but the quiet did. When Morty returned inside, he noticed the lantern had dimmed. Its light had turned silver, soft as the inside of a seashell. He lifted it and carried it through the rooms, watching how its glow revealed more memories hiding in the corners. In the kitchen, Rick sat slumped at the table, eyes half open, a cup of coffee untouched before him. He looked up when Morty entered. "Hey, kid," he murmured, voice rasping. "You feel it too?" Morty nodded. Everything stopped. Rick leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Yeah, I noticed. Figured the universe finally ran out of patience." Morty smiled faintly. "I don't think it's ending. I think it's listening." Rick squinted. "Listening to what?" "To itself." Rick's gaze softened just slightly. He reached for his mug but didn't drink. "That's a good line, kid. Kinda poetic. You writing fortune cookies now?" Morty shrugged. "Maybe." They sat together in the dim glow, no sound between them except breathing. Rick stared into the lantern's light. "I used to think stillness was death. You stop moving, you're done. But maybe stillness is what happens when everything finally makes sense." Morty said nothing. He just watched the shimmer move across Rick's face, the light catching in the tired lines around his eyes, turning them into rivers of silver. Hours passed, or maybe no time at all. The house began to hum. Not with energy, not with electricity, but with the low, deep vibration of life at peace. Every object seemed to join in. The walls, the floors, the old photographs, even the dust in the air. It was as though the entire house remembered everything it had ever held and decided to love it all at once. Morty closed his eyes. He could hear June's laughter echo faintly in the distance. Or maybe it was memory. He could hear the whisper of his shadow from long ago, the one that had once confessed all the things he couldn't say. And in that whisper was no fear anymore, no sadness, only truth. "You don't have to be light or dark," it murmured. "You just have to be whole." Morty smiled. He felt tears at the edges of his eyes, though they didn't fall. He whispered, "Thank you." When he opened his eyes again, the world was almost transparent. The walls seemed made of soft glass. The stars shone through the ceiling. He could see everything. The structure of the house, the pulse of Rick's heartbeat, the faint rhythm of distant galaxies. And within all that vastness, there was no urgency, only calm. Morty walked to the window and pressed his hand against the glass. It was neither cold nor warm. It felt like touching the surface of a dream. In the reflection, he didn't see himself. He saw the glow, faint, silver, eternal. The clock on his nightstand, silent since the evening, began to hum once more, not ticking, not marking time, but breathing in rhythm with him. It whispered without words, "You are not becoming something new. You are remembering what you already are." Morty let out a slow breath. "I think I finally get it," he said softly. "Stillness isn't the end. It's the beginning that stopped needing to hurry." He turned toward the hallway once more. Rick was standing there, framed by the doorway, hands in pockets. For a long time they just looked at each other, two figures in a house full of memories, both understanding without needing to speak. Rick nodded once, almost imperceptibly. Guess we made it through another night, huh? Morty smiled. Yeah, another night, and the silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was full, glowing with every word they didn't need to say. Outside, dawn began to glow faintly at the edge of the sky. The stars still hadn't moved, but light itself had decided to rise. Morty sat down beside the window, the lantern resting on his lap, and listened to the hum of the world holding its breath. He didn't feel small. He didn't feel afraid, he just felt here, and in the stillness, something inside him whispered a truth so gentle he almost missed it. The universe doesn't rush because it already knows where it's going. He smiled. And for the first time, the silence smiled back. That night, Morty dreamed again. It began the way all true dreams do, quietly, like the world was holding its breath before remembering how to speak. He was standing in a field made of glass. Every blade shimmered softly, catching the starlight and bending it into small arcs of silver. Above him, the sky rippled like water, stars drifting as if afloat on some unseen current. The moon hung low, patient and full. He felt no weight, no ache, only a sense of anticipation so gentle it felt like love. In the distance, a figure moved slowly through the haze. The air shimmered around her, not with heat, but with memory. June, older now, not in years, but in presence. Her hair, once dark and sharp, was now pale and soft, as though made of the same faint light that spilled from the sky. She walked barefoot, leaving behind faint ripples instead of footprints. Morty's breath caught. "June?" She smiled, that same calm, knowing smile that had once made the world seem less impossible. "You found it," she said simply. "Found what?" The stillness inside the noise. He wanted to run to her, but the dream moved differently here. Each step was more like a thought, and the closer he came, the more the space between them dissolved. Soon they were standing together, surrounded by the quiet hum of 1,000 unseen stars. June looked at him with eyes that shimmered like reflected dawn. "You've changed," she said softly. Morty laughed, a low, almost shy sound. "Yeah, I guess. I don't even know into what." "That's the thing about transformation," she replied. "It's not about becoming something else. It's about remembering that you were always more than one thing." Morty thought about that. The light beneath his skin, the silence that had replaced his fear, the way his heart no longer beat against the world, but with it. "I missed you," he said quietly. June tilted her head, the corners of her eyes softening. "You didn't lose me, Morty. You just had to walk far enough into yourself to hear me again." They stood together, the world around them breathing like an ocean. The glass field began to move, slow waves rising and falling, carrying the faint echoes of laughter, footsteps, whispers. June reached into her pocket and pulled out something small, her old recorder, the one she had left behind. It looked the same, yet different. Its surface shimmered with faint constellations, as if it had been recording the stars themselves. She handed it to him. "I think it's yours now." Morty held it carefully. "Does it still?" "Record," June smiled. "It listens." That's all it ever needed to do. He pressed the small red button. The recorder hummed faintly, then fell silent. "What's it hearing?" he asked. "Everything that doesn't need to be said," she answered. The dream shifted again. The glass field became a sea of light, each wave cresting in slow motion, each drop of luminescence holding the reflection of some memory. Morty saw himself walking through past versions of his life, the boy who was afraid, the one who tried to be brave, the one who doubted, the one who dreamed. They weren't ghosts. They were fragments that had found harmony. June watched him quietly. "You were never broken, Morty. You were just waiting for all your pieces to arrive." He nodded, unable to speak for a long moment. When he finally did, his voice trembled, but not from sadness, from gratitude. "You helped me see it. I only reminded you where to look." A wind moved across the sea, soft, warm, and familiar. The waves shimmered brighter, rising around them like curtains of light. "Are you leaving again?" Morty asked. June looked down, smiling faintly. "Dreams aren't places you stay, Morty. They're bridges. I came to show you how to cross." He swallowed, fingers tightening around the recorder. "I don't want to forget this. You won't." She reached out, brushing her fingers along his cheek. "Every time you listen, you'll remember. Not just me, but what we built inside the silence." The touch was weightless, yet real enough to make the world shimmer. Morty looked around, at the horizon where stars met sea, where light met breath. Is this where you've been? Everywhere, she said, and nowhere. I'm in the echoes now, the ones between moments, between thoughts. When you're quiet enough, you'll hear me. He nodded slowly. I think I already do, June smiled. Good, then you're ready. Ready for what? To wake up. The waves began to fall back, settling into glass again. The stars above started to move once more, returning to their orbits with lazy grace. The world was spinning again, but it didn't rush. It simply flowed. June stepped back. Her edges grew soft, translucent, as though she were dissolving into the air itself. Wait, Morty said, before you go. What happens now? She paused, looking at him one last time. Now you live like the dream never ended. He blinked and she was gone. The next moment he was back in his room. The lantern still burned faintly on the desk, silver and patient. The clock was quiet again. The air smelled like rain and static. He sat up slowly. The recorder was in his hand and real warm, glowing softly from within. He pressed play. There was no sound. Only the low hum of existence, the kind that fills the space between heartbeats. Then faintly a voice, June's, distant but smiling. Every version of you is still walking toward the same sunrise. Morty closed his eyes and listened until the silence itself felt alive. Morning came, though it arrived differently now, slower, more deliberate, as if the sun was careful not to disturb what had been learned in the night. Rick was at the kitchen table again, eyes half closed, fingers wrapped around a mug of something that steamed lazily. Morty sat down across from him. Neither spoke for a long time. Then Rick said, "You look like you've seen a ghost." Morty smiled faintly. "Not a ghost. A friend," Rick grunted. "Yeah, well, I hope they didn't talk you into any sentimental nonsense." Morty shrugged, looking down at the recorder. "No, she just reminded me to listen." Rick stared at him for a moment, then gave a small, tired smile, the kind that meant more than words ever could. "Good advice, kid." They drank in silence after that. Not the awkward kind. The kind that holds the weight of everything unspoken, everything understood. Later, when Rick dozed off again, Morty stepped outside. The morning light touched the grass in slow motion, each drop of dew reflecting a tiny universe. He lifted the recorder, pressed it to his chest and whispered, "I hear you." Somewhere deep inside, maybe in the quiet between stars, he could almost swear he heard laughter. Soft, distant, and full of peace. The world didn't spin faster. It didn't glow brighter. It just breathed, and Morty breathed with it. The transformation was nearly complete now, though he no longer thought of it as a change. It was simply the long return to what had always been waiting. He closed his eyes, smiled softly, and let the world hum. The night after June's return, the world began to shimmer differently, not brighter, not louder, just deeper. Every reflection seemed to hold a memory. Every breath carried something infinite. Rick noticed it first. The air in the garage had weight again. Not the heavy chemical haze of his experiments, but something finer like dust made from starlight. His tools hummed faintly on their own, as though responding to an invisible frequency. He leaned back in his chair, swirling the contents of a half-empty flask, and muttered, "Either the cosmos is syncing up again, or I finally tuned into the wrong frequency." Morty stood in the doorway, his face soft and unreadable. The recorder hung from his neck by a simple cord, glowing gently like a heartbeat. "It's not wrong," he said quietly. "You're just hearing what was always there." Rick raised an eyebrow. "You and your metaphysical enlightenment phase, huh?" Morty smiled. "It's not enlightenment, it's remembering." Rick squinted at him for a long moment, then looked down at the blueprint glowing on the table. It wasn't his usual design. No weapons, no portals, no containment units. Just a smooth circular frame lined with light, almost like an unfinished halo. "You still working on that?" Morty asked. Rick nodded. "Yeah, I don't even know why. Feels like it's building itself. Then maybe it's time to finish it." By dawn, the device was complete, though Rick would never admit it had been easy. It stood in the middle of the garage like a window made of slow-moving glass. Within its circular frame, light folded and unfolded like breath. Morty approached, heart calm, recorder silent. "What's it do?" Rick shrugged. "That's the thing. I didn't program it to do anything. It's just tuned to where thought meets reality." Morty stared at it, then at Rick. "Then maybe it's not a machine." Maybe it's a door, Rick smirked faintly. You been reading too many of those Beyond the Veil sleep pamphlets, kid? Morty didn't reply. He just stepped closer and reached out. The moment his hand touched the light, the air folded inward. The garage, the house, the gravity beneath their feet, all of it softened like a page turning itself. Rick sighed, downed the rest of his drink and muttered, "Fine, let's see where the universe wants to take us this time." He stepped through. They emerged into stillness. No horizon. No stars. Just a field of pale silver stretching infinitely outward, shimmering like frost on glass. Above them, light drifted in slow orbits, soft, pulsing like breathing suns. Each orb radiated a warmth that wasn't heat, but memory. Within their glow, faint images moved. Echoes of worlds, laughter, faces and skies that might have existed once, or might only have been imagined. Morty looked around, wonder rising like wind. "It's beautiful," Rick nodded slowly. "Yeah, the kind of beautiful that shouldn't exist." "Which means we're not in space. Then where?" Rick crouched, pressing his palm to the silver surface. The light beneath his fingers rippled, spreading in gentle circles. "It's thought-form energy, pure consciousness, unanchored, no coordinates. So, we're inside something's mind." Rick tilted his head, considering. Not something's, maybe everything's. They began to walk. The air, if it could be called that, was thick with resonance. Each step left behind a faint echo of color that slowly drifted away. As they moved, shapes began to form in the distance, vast orbs suspended in the void, blooming and closing like petals. Each was a miniature sun, soft, golden, humming with quiet rhythm. "The Garden of Quiet Suns," Morty whispered. The name arrived unbidden, as if the place had whispered it into him. Rick looked up at the slow dance of light. "Looks like each one's alive." "They are," Morty said. "Each one's a world that dreamed of peace and got it." Rick stared at him sideways. "You getting that from the lights or from your mystical guru phase?" Morty chuckled softly. "From both, I think." One of the suns drifted close, not flying, not moving, but arriving like a thought becoming real. Within its light, they could see faint silhouettes, cities made of air, rivers of sound, creatures woven from patience and memory. It hummed faintly, a sound too soft to hear but too present to ignore. Rick reached up, his reflection shimmering in the sphere's glow. For the first time in years, he looked less like a man and more like the echo of one. "I used to think creation was chaos," he said quietly. "Explosions, equations, noise. But this is symmetry," Morty nodded. "The kind that doesn't need to prove anything." Rick turned toward him, eyes softer now. "You sound like me when I was young and stupid," Morty smiled. "Then maybe you were right all along." Rick let out a short laugh, the kind that cracked the stillness but didn't break it. They walked further, passing beneath archways made of light. Between them, the quiet suns continued to bloom and fade. Some sang faintly in tones beyond hearing. Others wept silver rain that never reached the ground. And there, in the center of the field, stood something vast, a tree made entirely of reflection. Its trunk mirrored infinity, its branches curved into looping galaxies. Every leaf was a small living memory, people, stars, ideas and moments all shimmering in unison. Morty approached slowly. This is it, the center." Rick stared, breath low. "The root of consciousness itself, or maybe just the universe finally showing off." Morty touched the base of the tree. The surface rippled like liquid glass. He could see faces in it, his own, June's, Rick's, his mother's, countless selves, countless lives. "They're all here," he said softly. "Every version, every story," Rick's voice dropped to a whisper, "and all of them think they're the real one." The light deepened around them, gold turning to blue, blue to violet. The tree pulsed, one long, slow breath, and the entire garden responded. Every quiet sun blinked in harmony. For a moment, the universe was one heartbeat. Rick exhaled. "Morty, this isn't a place we're supposed to stay." "I know," Morty said, "but we had to see it." Rick glanced upward, his eyes catching the shimmer of 1,000 worlds. "You think this is what gods dream about?" Morty smiled faintly. "No, I think this is what dreams dream about." They stood there for what might have been hours or seconds. Time didn't work here, until the light began to fade. The suns dimmed to silver. The air softened to mist. The tree folded inward like a secret being gently kept. Morty turned to Rick. "Ready?" Rick hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, I think I am. They stepped back through the air, and the world folded them gently into itself. Not breaking, not tearing, just returning them to where light first began to think. When they woke, the garage was quiet again. The machine, the circle of light, and still stood there, but it was empty now. Its surface no longer shimmered. Morty glanced at Rick, who was staring blankly at the spot where they'd stood. Rick muttered, "Well, that's one hell of a morning." Morty smiled, faint but peaceful, the kind you don't need to understand. Rick looked at him, really looked, and for once didn't argue. He just nodded. The garden was gone, or maybe it wasn't. Maybe it had just moved inward. Morty touched his chest, feeling the faint pulse of the recorder beneath his shirt. The hum was still there, soft, eternal. "Alive," he whispered to no one in particular. "Thank you." And somewhere far beyond sound or time, the quiet suns pulsed once in reply. Morning arrived like a memory of light. The house didn't wake all at once. It sighed. The walls glowed faintly, the windows blurred with dew, and every object seemed to hum with the echo of something just remembered. Outside, the sky was pale gold, trembling softly, as if the universe itself were preparing to whisper goodbye. Morty stood at the window, watching the dawn breathe. He could still feel the rhythm of the garden pulsing beneath his skin. Every heartbeat shimmered faintly, like light moving through glass. Rick sat in the garage staring into nothing. Empty beakers. Cold coffee. The quiet hum of machinery that no longer knew what it was for. His reflection looked older than he felt, and for once he didn't reach for the bottle beside him. When Morty stepped into the doorway, Rick didn't look up. "Dream again?" he muttered. Morty nodded. "Not a dream, I think. More like a reminder." Rick smirked faintly. "Yeah, the cosmos sure loves reminding us of things we never asked to remember." Morty leaned against the table, looking at the small clock he'd kept since that morning long ago, the one with no hands. It was silent now, but somehow still alive. "Rick," he said quietly. "The stars are fading." Rick finally looked up. Through the garage window, the sky had begun to pale. The constellations shimmered faintly, then dimmed, not dying but sinking inward, like they were folding back into themselves. "About time," Rick said. "You can't shine forever. Even light needs to rest." Morty frowned. "They're not resting. They're going somewhere." Rick tilted his head, curious despite himself. "Where?" Morty placed a hand over his chest. "Here." The day passed like a long exhale. Every hour felt slower, each moment stretching like soft glass before breaking into stillness. The shadows on the walls grew longer, then shorter, then simply stopped moving. Morty spent most of it outside, lying in the grass. He could feel the faint hum beneath the earth. The same melody the stars once sang when they whispered his name. It was fainter now, more fragile, like a lullaby running out of breath. Rick sat beside him, knees drawn up, a rest silence between them. "Never figured you for the lying in the grass type," Rick said after a while. Morty smiled. "You never figured me for a lot of things." Rick huffed. "Fair. Still not sure what you've become, kid." "You're like half ghost, half light bulb." Morty chuckled softly. "Maybe that's just what growing up feels like." Rick stared out at the horizon. "If that's what it feels like, I'll stick to stagnating, thanks." Morty didn't answer. He just watched the clouds turn slow and golden. Every few minutes, another faint spark blinked out from the sky. It wasn't sadness that filled the air. It was something quieter. Something closer to acceptance. By dusk, the stars had begun their final descent. They fell not as fire, but as whispers, soft, luminous threads sliding gently through the sky. Each one left behind a faint trail that shimmered, then faded. The world wasn't ending. It was exhaling. Morty stood, feeling the hum inside him deepen. His fingertips glowed faintly, and when he breathed, tiny motes of starlight drifted from his mouth like fireflies. Rick watched in silence. He didn't take notes. He didn't reach for a scanner. He just watched, like a man finally willing to believe in something he couldn't explain. "What's happening to you?" he asked, voice low. Morty turned to him, eyes calm. "Nothing new. Just finishing what started." Rick frowned. "And what's that supposed to mean?" Morty smiled faintly. "Every version of me at every path, every choice listed, they're all coming home." Rick looked away, jaw tightening. "You sound like you're saying goodbye." Morty shook his head. "Not goodbye, just..." moving inward. That night, they sat on the roof together, the same spot they'd once used for stargazing years ago, when the world was simpler and the universe still felt like something to conquer. Now there was nothing left to conquer, only to understand. Morty leaned back, his glowing hand resting near the recorder. The hum of it matched the rhythm of his heart. Rick stared up at the emptying sky. "You know," he said, "I used to think endings were the worst part of any story. Turns out they're just the quietest." Morty smiled softly. "And sometimes the quiet part's the most honest." They sat like that for a long time. The stars kept dimming one by one, until only a handful remained, and then, slowly even those began to fade. Each light, as it vanished, left behind a faint trace that drifted toward Morty. Not falling, not flying, just coming home. When the first one touched him, he closed his eyes. A memory bloomed. Laughter under rain, the warmth of family dinners, the ache of loss. When the next one came, he saw other lives: painter, traveler, old man, boy with a telescope. Each light entered gently, as if asking permission, and with every one, he felt lighter, not empty, but complete. Rick said nothing. He just watched as the glow gathered around Morty's chest, then spread outward like dawn seen through water. The light didn't blind. It soothed. For the first time, Rick didn't feel like fixing it. He didn't feel the urge to interrupt, to rationalize, to run. He just breathed. "You're not dying, are you?" Rick asked, almost afraid of the answer. Morty opened his eyes. They shimmered faintly with galaxies. "No," he said, "just remembering where I came from." Rick stared at him, then at the dark sky. "And where's that?" Morty pointed upward, or inward. It was hard to tell. "The same place everything comes from." Rick exhaled a long, unsteady breath. "Guess that's as close to peace as we get." Morty nodded. For now, time thinned. The air grew still enough to hear their thoughts. The clock with no hands ticked once, just once, a sound that felt like the universe nodding in approval. Morty lay back, watching the last thread of light drift toward him. When it touched, the entire world seemed to sigh in relief. The grass shimmered. The house softened at the edges. Even Rick's outline seemed to blur, as if existence itself were loosening its hold. And then, silence. A silence so deep it wasn't absence, but presence. Morty whispered, "Rick." Rick turned his head, eyes tired but bright. "Yeah? Thanks, and for what?" "For showing me how to build something that doesn't break." Rick blinked. "What, like the portal gun?" Morty smiled faintly. "No, like love." Rick froze, half chuckling, half sighing. "You really are sentimental to the end, huh?" Morty's eyes drifted closed. "Maybe. Or maybe this is where it starts." For a long time there was only the sound of the wind, but it wasn't really wind. It was breath. The breath of a world remembering itself. Then faintly the first new star appeared, tiny, soft, patient. Rick watched as more began to follow, not bright but alive. Each one carried the same faint glow he'd seen in Morty's chest. He realized slowly that the light hadn't vanished. It had multiplied. Morty stirred beside him, eyes opening just enough to see. "They're back," he whispered. Rick nodded, voice low. "Maybe they never left. Just needed to find you first." Morty smiled, the edges of him faintly translucent now. "Then I guess we're both home." Rick looked at him, really looked, and for once said nothing. Just let the silence speak. The stars above glowed softly, not as distant fires, but as quiet reflections. Each one hummed a name, and though Rick couldn't hear them clearly, he knew one of those names was Morty. The long goodbye of light was never really a goodbye. It was the beginning of remembering. The world had grown impossibly still, not in the way of endings, but in the way of rest, a silence that had earned itself. The house was half lit, as though unsure whether to belong to night or dawn. Machines in Rick's garage gave off a low rhythmic hum, like distant breathing. Dust floated lazily through amber light. Morty sat by the window, his outline soft, almost translucent. Each movement left behind a faint shimmer, a trail of starlight that faded as soon as it appeared. He felt weightless but not hollow. It was the feeling of being both here and elsewhere, as if the universe had loosened its grip just enough to let him drift. Rick was at the desk, hands folded, chin resting on them. He had not slept in 2 nights, but his eyes were gentle, clearer than they'd been in years. "You still with me, kid?" he asked. Morty smiled faintly. Always, Rick huffed, trying for sarcasm, but the effort fell apart halfway. You sound like a ghost in a greeting card. Morty laughed quietly. The sound was warm, round, alive. Maybe I'm just trying to make it easy for you. Rick looked at him for a long moment, then turned his gaze back to the table. I don't need easy. I just need honest. I'm not leaving, Morty said softly. Not the way you think. Rick's jaw tightened and he nodded, though his throat trembled when he swallowed. Yeah, sure. The evening bled into night. Morty went outside one last time, barefoot on cool grass. The air was still except for the faint hum of the stars, quieter now but closer. He tilted his head back. Above him, the heavens were filled with slow-moving light. The stars were no longer scattered. They pulsed together, like a single breathing organism. Each pulse matched the rhythm in his chest. He whispered, I can hear you. And for the first time the universe answered, not with words but with warmth. Every atom of the night glowed for a heartbeat. The light didn't fall from the sky anymore. It rose from the ground, from the trees, from Morty's skin. Rick stepped into the doorway, leaning against the frame. Looks like they like you, he murmured. Morty smiled without turning around. They always did. I just didn't know how to listen. Rick hesitated, then stepped forward, standing beside him. Together they watched the stars breathe. You sure about this? Rick asked. Morty nodded slowly. I think I've been sure for a while. The transformation wasn't a flash. It was a release. Morty exhaled, and with the breath went everything that had ever been heavy. Fear, guilt, questions that never found their answers. What remained was light, not brightness, but the calm illumination of being seen. His body began to dissolve gently, particles of gold drifting upward, merging with the sky. Rick reached out instinctively, his hand passing through a faint shimmer. It didn't burn. It was cool, like touching water that remembered being rain. Morty's voice came softly, almost carried by the wind. Sayu taught me that even broken things can shine. Rick blinked hard, the old scientist in him trying to find something to fix, but there was nothing to fix. There was only wonder. You were the one who did the shining. Kid. The stars brightened again. 1,000 quiet suns bloomed and then stilled, their glow spreading like soft ripples through the sky. And somewhere in that glow, Rick saw her, June, or something of her. Not as a ghost, not as memory, but as a shape made of music and reflection. She stood beside Morty's dissolving form, her hand resting gently over his heart. When she looked at Rick, her smile carried no mystery. Only gratitude. Rick nodded once, a quiet, reluctant acknowledgement of something far bigger than him. Then June's voice, faint as wind through leaves. Every version of you made it home. The words lingered, wrapping around Morty like a blanket. His final breath became a shimmer of light that drifted upward, joining the stars until there was no distinction between boy and sky, between memory and light. Rick sat down in the grass. He didn't cry. Not in the old way. His eyes stung, but it felt like salt water healing a wound that had waited too long to close. He looked up at the night, vast, endless, alive, and for the first time, he didn't feel small. He whispered, You did good, Morty. The wind stirred gently, carrying a faint echo back to him. It wasn't words and it was laughter. Morty's laughter, distant and at peace. Rick smiled. Yeah, thought so. He leaned back, hands behind his head, and stared at the stars until they blurred into soft halos of gold. The grass whispered against his coat. The world hummed in low, patient chords. He didn't need to understand what had happened. For once, it was enough to feel it. Time passed in the way dreams do, an unmeasured, circular. The nights grew quieter. The stars, steadier. Rick still talked to the sky sometimes, mostly about small things. The taste of his new coffee blend, or the sound of rain on the roof, or how the portal gun still refused to work right. He'd pause sometimes as if waiting for a reply, and sometimes, just sometimes, he thought he heard one, a whisper in the static, a gentle hum, a laugh tucked inside the silence. It wasn't enough to fill the absence, but it was enough to remind him that absence itself was just another form of presence. One evening, weeks or lifetimes later, Rick wandered back to the garden, the one they'd once called the Garden of Quiet Suns. The flowers still glowed faintly, their light steady as breathing. He stood there for a long time, letting the glow wash over him. The quiet wasn't lonely anymore. It was sacred. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the clock with no hands. It was still ticking. "Guess time figured out how to move without me," he said softly. He set it down in the grass beside a single glowing flower. The clock ticked once more, then stopped. Not broken, but fulfilled. Rick straightened, his silhouette merging with the dusk. The stars above pulsed gently, as if nodding, and for the first time in a long while, Rick whispered something like a prayer. "Good night, kid." The air shimmered. Somewhere far beyond sight, starlight rearranged itself into new constellations. One of them, faint and kind, looked a little like a boy with his hand raised in farewell. Rick smiled at the sky. "Yeah, I see you." The wind brushed past him, soft, forgiving. He turned toward home, each step slow, unhurried. Behind him the stars hummed quietly, their light folding inward and outward in rhythm with his breath. As he reached the door, he paused, glanced once more at the glowing horizon, and murmured. And in the quiet between stars, he finally understood. The house sighed as he entered. The lights dimmed to gold. The hum of the world slowed to a whisper. Then softly the night spoke. "Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man."